Case 1. Lyle and Eric Menendez. On the evening of August 20th, 1989, residents of one of Beverly Hills' most exclusive neighborhoods had no idea that behind the walls of a Spanish-style mansion, two young men were about to shatter their family forever. The address was 722 North Elm Drive, and the Menendez family seemed to embody the American dream. Jose Menendez had immigrated from Cuba as a teenager with almost nothing. Through determination and business acumen, he'd climbed to the executive ranks of the entertainment industry. His wife, Mary Louise, known to everyone as Kitty, had been a beauty queen before dedicating herself to raising their two sons. Lyle, 21, attended Princeton University. Eric, 18, was a talented tennis player who ranked 44th nationally in his age group. From the outside, the family appeared to have it all. That night, Jose and Kitty settled into the family room to watch The Spy Who Loved Me. Somewhere around 10 p.m., their sons entered carrying 12-gauge Mossberg shotguns loaded with buckshot ammunition. What happened next would become one of the most shocking and debated crimes in American history. The brothers opened fire at close range. Jose was struck in the back of the head with a contact shot, along with additional wounds to his arms and legs. Kitty attempted to flee but was shot multiple times. The autopsy would later reveal she'd been struck 9 times across her body and head. In total, 15 shotgun blasts echoed through the mansion, leaving both parents dead in a scene of devastating violence. Lyle called 911 at 11:47 p.m., his voice breaking as he screamed into the phone that someone had killed his parents. When police arrived, they found the brothers distraught outside the home. The crime scene inside appeared to be the work of a professional hit, perhaps connected to Jose's business dealings in the entertainment industry. Detectives initially investigated whether the murders were mob-related. In the months that followed, the brothers' behavior began to raise questions. Eric and Lyle went on an extravagant spending spree, purchasing Rolex watches, expensive cars, and real estate. They spent hundreds of thousands of dollars from their parents' estate. To investigators, the spending didn't match the grief they displayed that night. The break in the case came from an unexpected source. Eric had been seeing a psychologist named Jerome Oziel, and during their sessions, he confessed to the murders. Oziel's girlfriend later went to police with information about the confession. By March 1990, both brothers were arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The case took a dramatic turn when the defense strategy emerged. The brothers weren't denying they'd killed their parents. Instead, they claimed they'd acted in self-defense after years of horrific sexual, physical, and emotional abuse at the hands of their father. Eric testified that Jose had molested him from childhood into his teenage years. Lyle stated that he'd confronted their parents about the ongoing abuse of Eric, and both brothers believed their father would kill them to keep the secret hidden. The first trial, which began in 1993, became a media sensation. Court TV broadcast the proceedings, and the nation watched as Eric and Lyle recounted graphic details of alleged abuse. The prosecution argued the brothers were motivated by greed, wanting to inherit their parents' multi-million-dollar estate. They pointed to the spending spree, Eric's screenplay about a son killing his parents for money, and a prior burglary spree where the brothers had stolen over $100,000 from homes in their neighborhood. The abuse allegations divided the courtroom and the country. Separate juries for each brother deadlocked. Some jurors believed the abuse claims warranted a manslaughter conviction rather than murder. Others saw calculated killers who'd crafted a defense to escape justice. Mistrials were declared for both brothers in January 1994. The second trial, which began in 1995, took a different turn. This time, the brothers were tried together before a single jury. Judge Stanley Weisberg ruled that much of the abuse evidence was inadmissible, determining the defense hadn't shown sufficient proof that the brothers faced imminent danger. The playing field had shifted dramatically. In March 1996, the jury convicted both Lyle and Eric of first-degree murder with special circumstances. In July, they were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The brothers were separated and sent to different facilities, unable to see each other for years. For nearly 3 decades, the case remained largely settled in the public consciousness. Then, in 2023, new evidence emerged. Roy Rosello, a former member of the boy band Menudo, came forward alleging that Jose Menendez had sexually abused him when he was 14 years old. Additionally, a letter Eric had written to a cousin before the murders surfaced, describing ongoing abuse by his father. These revelations prompted renewed scrutiny of the case. In 2024, then Los Angeles District Attorney George Gascon recommended resentencing the brothers, arguing that modern understanding of trauma and abuse would have resulted in different outcomes. In May 2025, a judge resentenced Eric and Lyle to life with the possibility of parole, making them immediately eligible for release. The brothers appeared at separate parole hearings in August 2025. Both expressed remorse and discussed their rehabilitation efforts in prison. Eric had earned multiple college degrees and worked in hospice care for dying inmates. Lyle had created programs to help fellow prisoners. Yet despite these efforts and their father's survival, the parole board denied release to both brothers. The commissioners cited prison rule violations and concerns about public safety, though acknowledging genuine remorse. The denial lasts a minimum of 3 years, though the brothers can petition for earlier hearings. The Menendez case refuses to fade because it forces uncomfortable questions. Were these cold-blooded killers who executed their parents for money and freedom, or were they traumatized victims who'd reached a breaking point after years of abuse? Could both things be true simultaneously? The case highlighted how society and the legal system struggled to address claims of abuse as a factor in violent crime, particularly when those claims involved sexual abuse of male victims by their father. The tragedy extends beyond that August night. Jose and Kitty Menendez never got to grow old, travel in retirement, or meet grandchildren. Their extended families lost beloved members. Whether the abuse allegations were true or fabricated, the brothers chose murder rather than simply walking away from their parents' home and control. 2 lives were ended, 2 more were consumed by prison, and the question of justice, of what would have been the right outcome, continues to divide opinion more than 35 years later. The name Menendez remains synonymous with one of America's most notorious family murders, a case where wealth, abuse allegations, and violence collided in a story that captivated the nation and still does today. Case 2, Joel Guy Jr. The Thanksgiving holiday in 2016 should have been a celebration for the Guy family. Joel Guy Sr., a 61-year-old pipeline engineering designer, had recently retired after a successful career. His wife Lisa, 55, worked in human resources and was planning her own retirement. After 31 years of marriage, they were finally ready to enjoy the fruits of their labor. They'd sold their Knoxville home and purchased property in Sirgoensville, Tennessee, where they planned to spend their golden years. Their son, Joel Michael Guy Jr., drove up from Baton Rouge, Louisiana for the holiday weekend. At 28 years old, he'd spent nearly a decade supposedly attending Louisiana State University. His parents had funded his education, his housing, and his living expenses. They'd even purchased a lakeside townhouse for him to live in. What they didn't know was that their son had never graduated, had never held a paying job, and had become entirely dependent on their financial support. That dependency was about to end, and Joel Jr. knew it. His parents had made a decision. With both retiring and facing their own financial realities, they could no longer support their adult son. They planned to tell him at Christmas that the money would stop flowing. But Joel Jr. had learned of their plans earlier, and he'd already made his own decision about how to respond. Starting on November 7, 2016, security cameras at various stores captured Joel Jr. purchasing supplies. At an Ace Hardware in Napoleonville, Louisiana, he bought muriatic acid and food-grade hydrogen peroxide. On November 18th, he was recorded at Home Depot buying a bleach sprayer, extension cords, and a timer. He purchased knives at other locations. He bought large plastic containers. He obtained protective equipment. Each purchase was methodical, calculated, and paid for in cash to avoid a paper trail. But the most chilling evidence of premeditation would be found later, a notebook in Joel Jr.'s handwriting. Prosecutors would call it the Book of Premeditation. In detailed notes, he'd outlined every step of his plan. Douse killing rooms, kitchen, with bleach. One entry read. Flush chunks down toilet, not garbage disposal, read another. He listed items needed: killing knives, carving knives, a sledgehammer to crush bones, a blender, and food grinder to process remains. He'd even written, kill dog, before crossing it out and replacing it with, take the dog with you. The notebook revealed something more disturbing than just a murder plan. It showed cold calculation about the financial aftermath. Joel Jr. had listed his parents' assets in detail, including their home, life insurance policies, and bank accounts. He'd mapped out how he would inherit everything if both parents were dead or missing. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of rage. This was a business plan for murder. Thanksgiving Day came and went peacefully. The family gathered, shared a meal, and spent time together. Joel Jr.'s 3 half-sisters were there, visiting what would be the last holiday in the Knoxville home. On Friday, November 25th, the sisters left to return to their own lives. Only Joel Jr. remained. The following day, November 26th, Joel Guy Sr. was in a second-floor exercise room of the home. The evidence would later suggest this is where Joel Jr. attacked him, stabbing his father 42 times with such force that the knife struck bone repeatedly. 12 of the wounds were so severe they left marks ranging from scratches to complete severing of ribs. Joel Sr.'s lungs, kidneys, and liver were damaged. One blow was so violent that a fragment of the knife broke off and embedded in his shoulder muscle. The scene showed evidence of a desperate struggle: torn blinds, blood on walls, an overturned Bowflex machine. While his father lay dead or dying in the exercise room, Joel Jr. waited. His mother was at Walmart grocery shopping for the weekend. Security footage captured Lisa Gee selecting items, including perishable goods, unaware that her son was preparing to kill her the moment she walked through the door. When Lisa arrived home, she entered through the front door and dropped the grocery bags on the foyer floor. She proceeded upstairs, perhaps calling out for her husband. Joel Jr. attacked her with the same brutal efficiency he'd shown his father. Lisa was stabbed 31 times. 9 of her ribs were severed. Like her husband, she fought for her life, but she never had a chance against her son's calculated violence. Then came the dismemberment. Following his notebook's instructions, Joel Jr. set about destroying the evidence. He removed Joel Sr.'s hands at the wrists, leaving them on the exercise room floor. He severed both parents' arms at the shoulders and their legs at the hips and knees. He placed the torsos and limbs into 45-gallon plastic containers and filled them with the corrosive chemicals he'd purchased weeks earlier. The notebook had explained this would speed up decomposition and might melt fingerprints. In what investigators would later describe as one of the most disturbing aspects of an already horrific crime, Joel Jr. carried his mother's severed head downstairs to the kitchen. He placed it in a large pot on the stove and turned on the heat. The forensic examiner would later testify that the head hadn't just been cut off, it had been broken off with force. Joel Jr. turned the home's thermostat to 90 degrees to accelerate decomposition. He planned to burn down the house to destroy remaining evidence, having purchased a timer to create a delayed ignition. But his plan began to unravel when he sustained cuts to his hands during the attacks, including a deep wound to his left thumb. Security footage from a Walmart near the murder scene showed Joel Jr. in the first aid section later that day, purchasing ointment, bandages, isopropyl alcohol, and hydrogen peroxide. His hand was visibly injured, rather than complete his plan. To burn the house and finish disposing of the bodies, he drove back to Baton Rouge on Sunday to seek medical treatment at a student health clinic, intending to return to Knoxville to finish his work. He never got that chance. On Monday morning, November 28th, Lisa Guy failed to show up for work. Her supervisor grew concerned when she didn't answer calls or messages. It was completely out of character for Lisa, who was known for her reliability. The supervisor contacted police and requested a welfare check. Officers arrived at the Golden View Lane home around 3:30 p.m. What they discovered was described by investigators as one of the most horrific crime scenes they'd ever encountered. Joel Sr.'s severed hands lay on the floor, the plastic containers filled with human remains in corrosive liquid, what prosecutors would call a diabolical stew of human remains, sat in the bathroom. Lisa's head was in the pot on the stove. Blood saturated nearly every surface. The smell was overwhelming, requiring hazmat teams to process the scene. Meanwhile, Joel Jr. had already begun accessing his parents' finances. He'd used his dead father's fingerprint to unlock his phone, then started draining bank accounts. He was waiting in Baton Rouge for the life insurance payout, apparently believing he'd successfully staged the scene to appear as though his parents had simply disappeared. On November 29th, the FBI's Baton Rouge Safe Streets Task Force, working with the East Baton Rouge Sheriff's Office and Knox County authorities, arrested Joel Jr. at his residence. When they searched his car trunk, they found a meat grinder, another item mentioned in his notebook. The evidence against Joel Guy Jr. was overwhelming, the notebook detailing every step of the crime. Security footage showing him purchasing supplies over weeks, his injured hands, his access to his parents' accounts immediately after their deaths, the timeline that placed him at the scene, cell phone records, computer searches for terms like how to dissolve a body. Joel Jr.'s trial began in September 2020. His defense team had little to work with. Their strategy focused on attacking the investigation and claiming the evidence didn't definitively place Joel Jr. as the killer. His attorney, John Halstead, argued that Joel Jr. had been outgoing, friendly, and happy over the Thanksgiving holiday, suggesting his demeanor didn't match someone plotting double murder. The prosecution presented a different picture. They walked the jury through the notebook, the purchases, the timeline, and the crime scene. They showed Joel Jr.'s complete financial dependence on his parents. They presented testimony from his half-sisters, who confirmed their parents planned to cut him off financially. Assistant District Attorney Leslie Nasios told jurors that when faced with losing the lifestyle he'd become accustomed to, Joel Jr. chose murder over getting a job. On October 2, 2020, after approximately 3 hours of deliberation, the jury found Joel Guy Jr. guilty on all 7 counts. 2 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of felony murder for killing Lisa while killing Joel, 2 counts of felony murder while committing theft, and 2 counts of abuse of a corpse. At sentencing, Joel Sr.'s daughters delivered victim impact statements. Shandice Fink described her father and Lisa as wonderful people who loved him so much. Michelle Tyler said she would never be able to forgive her half-brother for murdering her parents. Judge Steve Sword sentenced Joel Jr. to life in prison for each murder count, with eligibility for parole only after serving 51 years. Additional time was added for the corpse abuse charges. In 2023, Joel Jr. filed an appeal seeking to overturn his conviction. The appeal was denied. He remains incarcerated in Tennessee, where he'll be at least 79 years old before he's eligible to even be considered for parole. The Guy family murders stand out even in the annals of family violence for the sheer calculation involved. This wasn't a moment of rage or a psychotic break. Joel Jr. spent weeks planning every detail. He researched methods, he purchased supplies, he wrote instructions for himself, he drew diagrams of his parents' assets. And when the moment came, he executed his plan with methodical precision, showing no hesitation in stabbing his father 42 times or attacking his mother the instant she walked through the door. What makes the case particularly disturbing is the complete lack of empathy it revealed. These weren't strangers or enemies. They were the parents who'd raised him, supported him financially for 28 years, bought him a townhouse, and funded a decade of his life while he pretended to attend college. Their only crime was deciding they could no longer carry him financially into middle age. For the investigators, prosecutors, and court personnel who worked the case, the psychological toll was significant. Knox County District Attorney General Charm Allen described it as horrific for the family to experience and emotionally taxing even for seasoned law enforcement. The crime scene photos and evidence were so disturbing that viewing them became a traumatic experience in itself. Joel Guy Sr. and Lisa Guy should be enjoying retirement together right now. They should be traveling, spending time with grandchildren, living in their Surgoinsville home, and reaping the rewards of 3 decades of hard work and marriage. Instead, they were brutally murdered by the son they'd supported and loved, their bodies desecrated, their home turned into a nightmare, and their final moments filled with terror at the hands of the child they'd raised. Joel Jr.'s half-sisters were left without their father and stepmother. The community of Knoxville was traumatized, and society was left with another reminder that the darkest evil can sometimes come from within a family, wearing the face of someone who should protect and honor, not destroy. Case 3. Chandler Halderson. In the quiet suburb of Windsor, Wisconsin, just outside Madison, the Halderson family appeared to have much to celebrate in the summer of 2021. Their younger son, Chandler, 23, was about to graduate from Madison College with a degree in IT. Even better, he'd landed a dream job at SpaceX, Elon Musk's aerospace company. His parents, Bart and Krista, couldn't have been prouder. Their son was an Eagle Scout, a responsible young man who seemed destined for success. But every single detail of that success story was a lie. And when those lies were about to be exposed, Chandler Halderson made a choice that would destroy his family forever. Bart Halderson, 50, worked hard to provide for his family. Krista, 53, balanced her career with being a devoted mother to Chandler and his older brother Mitchell. By all accounts, they were supportive parents who believed in their sons and encouraged their ambitions. They had no reason to doubt Chandler when he told them about his academic progress and job prospects. Why would they? He was their son, an Eagle Scout, someone they'd raised to be honest and responsible. The truth was far different. Chandler had flunked out of Madison College after barely completing a semester. But rather than tell his parents, he'd constructed an elaborate fantasy world. He created fake emails that appeared to come from college administrators, discussing his coursework and upcoming graduation. He forged transcripts showing excellent grades. When his parents asked about classes, he provided detailed descriptions of courses he'd never taken. The deception expanded over time. Chandler claimed he was working at American Family Insurance, a respected company in Madison. He said he was helping with dive units for Madison Police and the Wisconsin DNR. None of it was true. Neither the police nor the DNR even had dive units. American Family Insurance had no record of him ever working there. Then came the SpaceX story. Chandler told his parents he'd been offered a position at the company and would be relocating. He showed them what appeared to be official communications about the job, start dates, and relocation details. Bart and Krista were thrilled. Their son was going to work for one of the most innovative companies in the world. But as June turned to July 2021, cracks began to appear in Chandler's facade. His parents were persistent in their support, wanting to make sure everything was in order for their son's big transition. They asked questions. They wanted to verify details. They wanted to help with the move. And Bart, like any protective father, decided to do some checking on his own. On June 30th, Bart called Madison College. The call was recorded for customer service purposes. What he learned shattered everything he believed about his son's life. Chandler wasn't enrolled. He hadn't been for some time. There was no upcoming graduation. The college had no record of the communications. Chandler had been showing his parents. Bart then confronted Chandler about the phone number listed on one of the fake emails. When Bart called it, the person who answered sounded suspiciously like Chandler himself. Police would later trace that number to a burner phone found in Chandler's room. A meeting was scheduled at Madison College for 3:00 p.m. on July 1st, 2021, so Bart and Chandler could speak with administrators about Chandler's actual status at the school. That morning, Bart texted Chandler, "I'm ready whenever you are." The message arrived at approximately 2:10 p.m. The meeting never happened. According to prosecutors, approximately 50 minutes after that text message, Bart Halderson was shot in the back in the basement of the family home. The weapon was a semi-automatic rifle that had been given to Chandler as a gift by a friend named Andrew Smith. Smith testified at trial that he'd given Chandler the gun and nearly 480 rounds of ammunition, and that Chandler had seemed happy to receive it, displaying a big smile. Bart was shot at close range. The force of the bullet and his catastrophic injuries meant he likely died quickly, but the scene showed he'd been in the exercise area of the basement when attacked from behind. While his father's body lay in the basement, Chandler texted his mother. Krista was at work that afternoon. Chandler told her that Bart's phone had died and that she should text him if she needed anything. He also requested that she stop on the way home to buy soda, a delay tactic, prosecutors argued, to give him more time to prepare. When Krista Halderson arrived home from work that afternoon, she walked into a nightmare. Chandler shot and killed his mother. The medical examiner couldn't determine her exact cause of death because the only remains of Krista that were ever found were her legs. Everything else had been destroyed or hidden so thoroughly it was never recovered. Over the next several days, Chandler set about dismembering his parents' bodies. He used axes, saws, and knives to cut them apart. He attempted to burn some remains in the family fireplace. Investigators would later find over 50 fragments of cranial bone, teeth, and a dental cap in the fireplace ash. Bart's torso was discovered on July 8th in a field near a farm property in Windsor that was owned by someone Chandler knew. The remains showed multiple bullet wounds and evidence of dismemberment. The rifle that had been used to kill Bart was found hidden in a barn at the same property. Krista's legs were found on July 14th near the Wisconsin River in Roxbury, an area Chandler was known to frequent. It was his favorite swimming spot, a remote location with difficult access. A screenshot from Snapchat would prove crucial. Chandler's girlfriend, Kat Melander, had taken a photo of him at that exact location on July 3, 2021, just 2 days after the murders. The Snapchat Snap Map feature, which tracks and shares users' locations, placed Chandler at the Wisconsin River at the precise area where his mother's remains would later be discovered. But before the bodies were found, Chandler had already set his cover story in motion. On July 2nd, Krista didn't show up for work. Her coworker and friend Daniel Kroninger grew concerned when she didn't respond to messages. This was completely unlike Krista, who was known for her reliability and dedication. Kroninger went to the Halderson house and encountered Chandler, who told him his parents had gone to their family cabin in Langlade County for the July 4th weekend. When Bart and Krista still hadn't returned or answered calls by July 7th, Croninger urged Chandler to contact police. That afternoon, Chandler reported his parents missing. He told Dane County Sheriff's deputies that his parents had been picked up by another couple he didn't know and driven to the cabin, and they'd never arrived. Chandler's older brother Mitchell drove to the family cabin 3 hours north, meeting Langlade County Sheriff's deputies there. Together, they searched the property thoroughly. It was immediately clear that no one had been to the cabin in a long time. There were no signs of Bart and Krista Halderson anywhere. As detectives investigated the disappearance, they began interviewing Chandler more closely. His story didn't hold up under scrutiny. He claimed he didn't know who the couple was that had picked up his parents. He couldn't provide details about their plans. And when investigators started checking his background, the elaborate web of lies began to unravel. They discovered Chandler had been lying about attending Madison College. They found evidence of the forged emails and transcripts. The SpaceX job didn't exist. Prosecutors presented evidence that Chandler had fabricated all the communications. They learned he'd been lying to his girlfriend, Kat Melander, as well, who believed he was working and going to school and had affectionately nicknamed him Hubby. Then came the physical evidence. Investigators found that Chandler had purchased a tarp and 20 pounds of ice shortly before his parents disappeared. The tarp was similar to one found at the farm where Bart's remains were discovered. Security footage showed him buying these items. His computer searches revealed he'd been looking up information about body disposal and decomposition. On July 8, 2021, Chandler Halderson was arrested and charged with providing false information about missing persons. As the investigation continued and remains were discovered, the charges escalated to first-degree intentional homicide, mutilating corpses, and hiding corpses. Chandler's trial began in January 2022 in Dane County. The prosecution's case was methodical and overwhelming. Deputy District Attorney William Brown told the jury, "The evidence in this case you'll find is overwhelming. Chandler Halderson killed his parents on July 1st, 2021. He cut up their bodies with axes and saws and knives, and he didn't even give them the dignity of having a funeral or even a final resting place in one piece or together." The prosecution presented the fake emails, the forged transcripts, the burner phone, the timeline of texts and calls, the Snapchat location data, the security footage of purchases, the rifle, and the remains themselves. They showed how Chandler's entire life had been built on deception, and when his father was about to expose those lies at the college meeting, Chandler chose murder. The defense, led by attorney Crystal Vera, faced an uphill battle. Their strategy focused on the idea that while Chandler was clearly a liar, that didn't make him a killer. All the state was able to prove is that Chandler is a liar, not a killer, Vera argued. The defense pointed out there was no direct eyewitness to the murders and suggested reasonable doubt remained about who actually killed Bart and Krista. But the evidence was too strong. The timeline placed Chandler at the scene. The Snapchat data placed him at the body disposal site. The rifle used to kill Bart was his. The tarp matched. The lies about his parents' whereabouts began immediately. And, perhaps most damning, Chandler had been living a double life built entirely on deception, exactly the kind of situation that would create a motive for murder when exposure loomed. After approximately 2 hours of deliberation spread over 2 days, the jury returned unanimous guilty verdicts on all 8 charges, 2 counts of first-degree intentional homicide, mutilating corpses, hiding corpses, and providing false information about missing persons. On March 17, 2022, Chandler Halderson appeared before Judge John Hyland for sentencing. Chandler had filed a motion asking not to be present, essentially requesting to skip his own sentencing. Judge Hyland denied the request, citing a Wisconsin Supreme Court precedent that defendants must be present for sentencing. At the hearing, Chandler spoke briefly, saying he planned to appeal his conviction and asking interested attorneys to contact him. "It's not that I do not have feelings, it's that I was warned to not show them in the scrutiny of this case," he said, his words revealing nothing about remorse or acknowledgement of his crimes. Assistant District Attorney Andrea Raymond addressed the court, noting that Chandler grew up with a life of privilege that made his crimes even more difficult to understand. Deputy District Attorney Brown was more direct. When faced with, in the grand scheme of things, a minor inconvenience in his life, Mr. Halderson chose to commit first-degree homicide 2 times, and over the course of several days chose to cut up those people's bodies and spread them around the state. "I don't know how you protect the public from someone like that. As long as he breathes, he will be a risk," Judge Hyland agreed. "I have to, for this sentencing, ensure that the only time Mr. Halderson comes back into the community is to have the privilege of the burial he denied his parents," he said. Chandler was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for each murder count to be served concurrently. He will die in prison. In April 2023, 2 of Chandler's convictions related to hiding his parents' remains were vacated on procedural grounds related to how Wisconsin statute defines the offense. However, the murder convictions stand, and his life sentence remains unchanged. He is currently incarcerated at Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin. Krista Halderson's cousins spoke to media about the unbearable loss. Barbie Townsend described the case as something you couldn't write. It just wasn't anything that you could possibly come up with in your head. The family struggled with one fundamental question. We don't have a why, and that's the hard part. But prosecutors and investigators believed they understood the why. Chandler had built an entire false reality to avoid disappointing his parents and admitting failure. When Bart and Krista began to verify his claims, doing what any caring parents would do, the facade began to crumble. Rather than face the truth, rather than admit he'd lied for years, rather than accept responsibility and disappoint his parents, Chandler chose to eliminate them entirely. The case highlighted the dark side of achievement pressure and the extreme lengths some people will go to maintain an illusion of success. Chandler wasn't facing homelessness or starvation. He was living at home with supportive parents. The minor inconvenience prosecutors referenced was having to admit he'd failed at college and lied about his prospects. Most people in that situation would feel shame, accept consequences, and work to rebuild. Chandler Halderson chose murder. The digital evidence that convicted him, Snapchat location data, security footage, computer searches, cell phone records, fake email accounts, illustrated how technology has transformed criminal investigations. The same tools Chandler likely thought made him sophisticated and untraceable became the evidence that sealed his fate. Bart and Krista Halderson raised 2 sons. Mitchell, their older boy, built a real career in technology and was planning his wedding. He was everything they'd hoped for: successful, honest, independent. Chandler was supposed to be following a similar path. Instead, he became the person who ended their lives, who dismembered their bodies, who scattered them across Wisconsin, and who reported them missing while their remains lay hidden in locations he'd chosen. Krista's body was never fully recovered. Somewhere in southern Wisconsin, parts of a loving mother and dedicated professional remain lost. Bart received no funeral in one piece, his remains discovered in a field like discarded trash. Their final moments were filled with betrayal and violence at the hands of the son they'd supported, believed in, and loved unconditionally. The name Chandler Halderson now represents more than just another family murder. It stands as a cautionary tale about the dangerous intersection of lies, pressure, and violence. It's a reminder that an Eagle Scout uniform and a supportive family are no guarantee against evil. And it's a testament to how modern investigative techniques can follow a digital trail that leads straight to a killer, even when that killer is skilled at deception and tried so hard to hide what he'd done. Case 4. Tyler Hadley. On the afternoon of July 16, 2011, Tyler Hadley posted a message on his Facebook wall. "Party at my crib tonight, maybe." It seemed like a typical teenage invitation, the kind that gets posted thousands of times every day across social media. But the party Tyler was planning would be unlike anything his friends could imagine. By the time the first guests arrived, both of his parents would be dead, their bodies hidden in the master bedroom, while teenagers drank, laughed, and celebrated just feet away. Tyler Hadley was 17 years old and living in Port St. Lucie, Florida, with his parents Blake and Mary Jo. To say he was troubled would be an understatement. His record included arrests for arson, vandalism, theft, and aggravated battery. He'd hit and injured a child while driving his father's car in June 2010, resulting in a $15,000 civil suit. He'd been involved in drug use, sales, and purchases. His parents had enrolled him in an outpatient drug treatment program, but it had failed. Tyler continued using drugs. Blake and Mary Jo Hadley were at their wits' end. They loved their son, but they were watching him spiral out of control. Knowing Tyler would soon turn 18, they felt desperate to help him before he became a legal adult. They'd recently found an inpatient treatment program and told Tyler he would be attending. It was a last-ditch effort to save their son from himself. Tyler had other plans. According to later testimony, he didn't want to go to the treatment facility. And weeks before July 16th, he'd told at least one friend exactly what he intended to do about it. He wanted to throw a party after killing his parents. A parricide party because, as he put it, it had never been done before. That Saturday morning began like many others. Blake and Mary Jo went about their day, perhaps hoping the treatment program would be the turning point their son needed. They had no idea that Tyler had already begun inviting people to his party, posting on Facebook at 12:15 p.m., hours before the murders took place. Around 5 o'clock p.m., Tyler took 3 pills of ecstasy. The drug coursed through his system as he prepared to do the unthinkable. His mother, Mary Jo, was working on her computer, focused on whatever task occupied her attention. Tyler approached from behind. He raised a hammer and struck her in the head repeatedly. She died where she sat. Blake's death followed. Tyler attacked his father with the same weapon, bludgeoning him with the hammer until he was certain Blake was dead. The violence was brutal and direct. Tyler then began staging his party venue. He moved both bodies into the master bedroom. He locked the family's black Labrador in a closet. The dog, Tyler suspected, would have defended his parents and might alert guests to what lay behind the bedroom door. Tyler used his parents' credit cards to fund the party. Security cameras captured him at an ATM, pulling money from their accounts. He picked up friends and purchased alcohol and supplies. Then the guests began arriving. Approximately 60 people showed up at the Hadley house that night. They were teenagers, many from Tyler's high school, looking for a place to hang out on a Saturday night. Music played, people drank, conversations flowed, and in the master bedroom, just down the hallway, Blake and Mary Jo Hadley lay dead. Several people at the party would later report noticing a strange smell. Some described it as the smell of dead bodies, though at the time they didn't seriously consider that possibility. The odor was strong enough that multiple guests commented on it, but the party continued. Teenagers kept arriving, kept drinking, kept celebrating. Tyler moved through his own party in what witnesses described as an increasingly agitated state. As the night wore on and the drugs in his system mixed with the reality of what he'd done, he began telling people his secret. Not just one person, multiple people. He confessed to several party guests that he'd killed his parents. Most of them didn't believe him. It seemed like the kind of dark joke a high teenager might make, shocking for attention, but surely not real. One person took him seriously. Michael Mandel was Tyler's close friend, and during the party, Tyler pulled him aside for a walk. Away from the crowd and music, Tyler told Mandel what he'd done. He confessed to murdering his parents. Mandel was stunned, but Tyler led him back to the house and showed him the master bedroom. Mandel saw Blake and Mary Jo's bodies. The horror was real. But Mandel didn't immediately call police. He didn't shut down the party or demand everyone leave. Instead, he returned to the gathering, spending several more hours with Tyler. He even took a selfie with him. 4 hours would pass between Mandel seeing the bodies and finally leaving the party to call a local crime hotline. The 911 call came in, and police rushed to the Hadley residence. When they arrived and entered the home, they discovered the crime scene. Blake and Mary Jo had been dead for hours while their son hosted a party in their home. Investigators were horrified not just by the murders themselves, but by the bizarre circumstances. The celebration that had occurred with corpses hidden mere feet away. Tyler Hadley was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The evidence against him was overwhelming. He'd confessed to multiple people. His friend had seen the bodies. His DNA was at the scene. His parents' blood was found on items he'd handled. The timeline of his Facebook posts, his ATM withdrawals, his drug use, and the party itself all pointed to premeditation and calculated action. The motive, according to investigators and Tyler's own statements, was simple. He didn't want to go to the treatment facility his parents had arranged. Rather than run away, rather than refuse treatment, rather than face any consequences or disappoint his parents further, Tyler chose to eliminate them entirely. He could have his freedom and his party if Blake and Mary Jo were no longer alive, to enforce rules or send him to rehab. The case didn't go to trial in the traditional sense. In 2014, Tyler Hadley pleaded no contest to 2 counts of first-degree murder. By entering this plea, he didn't admit guilt, but acknowledged that the state had enough evidence to convict him. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Tyler Hadley, who committed his crimes at 17, will spend the rest of his life behind bars. The impact on the Port St. Lucie community was profound. Parents questioned how such horror could happen in their neighborhood. Teachers and school officials wondered what they'd missed. Friends who'd attended the party struggled with guilt and confusion. Some had literally danced and laughed while Blake and Mary Jo's bodies grew cold in the next room. The party guests faced their own reckoning. How had they not realized something was wrong? The smell that multiple people noticed. Why hadn't anyone investigated? When Tyler confessed to several people at the party, why had no one believed him enough to check or call police immediately? These questions haunted many who'd been there that night. For Michael Mandel, the burden was especially heavy. He'd seen the bodies, he'd known for certain. Yet he spent 4 more hours at the party, took a selfie with a double murderer, and only contacted authorities after leaving. Why the delay? The psychology of that decision, knowing someone has killed their parents but continuing to socialize with them, remains difficult to comprehend. The case also highlighted the warning signs that had been present for years. Tyler's criminal record was extensive for a teenager: arson, vandalism, theft, battery. He'd been in and out of trouble repeatedly. His drug use was escalating. His parents were so concerned they were pursuing inpatient treatment. The school system, the juvenile justice system, and the community had all interfaced with Tyler's behavioral problems. Yet nothing had prevented the trajectory toward violence. Tyler had even verbalized his plan to a friend weeks before the murders. He'd said he wanted to kill his parents and throw a party because it had never been done before. This statement, reported later, suggested Tyler saw the act as something novel, almost as performance art. The party wasn't just an alibi or a celebration of freedom. It was part of the plan itself, the unique twist that would make his crime memorable. The intersection of drug use and violence in this case cannot be ignored. Tyler took 3 ecstasy pills before killing his parents. While drugs don't create murderers, the combination of his existing antisocial behavior, his substance abuse, and his resentment about forced treatment created a perfect storm. The ecstasy may have lowered whatever inhibitions remained, allowing him to carry out the violent acts he'd been contemplating. Blake and Mary Jo Hadley were 54 and 47 years old. They'd spent nearly 2 decades trying to help their son, loving him despite his problems, seeking treatment for him, and hoping he could turn his life around. Their reward for this dedication was to be bludgeoned to death with a hammer, their bodies stashed in their own bedroom, and their home turned into a party venue for teenagers who danced on the other side of the wall from their corpses. The family dog, locked in the closet to prevent it from alerting guests, was found alive but traumatized. Tyler had written "kill dog" in his notes, but crossed it out, replacing it with "take the dog with you," one of the few merciful decisions he made that day, though the animal remained imprisoned and terrified throughout the party. The story of Tyler Hadley's crime spread beyond Florida, becoming national news because of its bizarre and disturbing nature. It's been featured on numerous true crime programs and documentaries. The image of teenagers partying while bodies lay hidden nearby struck a particular chord of horror with the public. It seemed to symbolize something larger, a generation so disconnected, so desensitized, that they could dance and drink feet away from murdered parents. But perhaps that interpretation is too broad. What happened at the Hadley house that July night was the result of one troubled teenager's violent choice and the dozens of guests who didn't know, didn't believe, or didn't act on what they suspected. It was a failure of intervention systems that had encountered Tyler repeatedly but couldn't stop his trajectory. It was parents who loved their son desperately but couldn't save him or themselves from his violence. Tyler Hadley is now in his early 30s, serving his life sentence in a Florida prison. He has no possibility of parole, no chance of release. The party ended when police arrived, and his adult life has been spent behind bars, exactly where the judge determined he needed to be to protect society. The 60 people who attended that party carry their own burdens. They were teenagers looking for fun on a summer night, and they unknowingly celebrated while 2 people lay murdered in the next room. Some smelled death but didn't recognize it. Some heard Tyler's confession but dismissed it. One saw the bodies but waited hours to report. None of them could have stopped what had already happened, but the memory of that night, the music, the laughter, the horrible truth hidden just feet away, will likely haunt them for the rest of their lives. Case 5. Grant Amato. Grant Amato had a good life, at least on paper. He'd graduated from nursing school, worked at a respected hospital, and lived with his supportive family in suburban Orlando. His father, Chad, was a clinical pharmacist with a successful career. His mother, Margaret, worked as a senior operations manager overseeing medical coders. His older brother, Cody, had achieved what Grant hadn't, completing a nurse anesthetist program and building an impressive career. The Amato family seemed stable, accomplished, and close-knit. But in June 2018, everything started to unravel. Grant was suspended from his job at Advent Health Orlando under suspicion of stealing medication from patients and improperly administering drugs. He also expressed suicidal thoughts to coworkers. The suspension ended his nursing career and left him living at home, unemployed and adrift. Then Grant discovered Sylvia Venceslavova, known online as Sylvie or Addie Sweet. She was a Bulgarian webcam model who performed on adult websites. Grant became obsessed. Night after night, he logged onto the family computer to watch her model and dance for hours. He paid thousands of dollars for access to her photos and videos. He showered her with gifts and money, creating the illusion that he was wealthy and successful. There was one major problem. Grant didn't have thousands of dollars to spend. So he began stealing from his family. He took money from his father, Chad. He stole from his brother, Cody. He opened lines of credit in his relatives' names without permission. He forged signatures. He drained accounts. Pictures of credit cards belonging to his grandmother Gloria, his uncle Troy, and cousins were found on his computer after the murders. In total, Grant stole approximately $200,000 from his family to fund his obsession with a woman he'd never met in person. When the family discovered what Grant had been doing, they were devastated, but determined to help. Chad took out a second mortgage on the family home to cover $150,000 in debt Grant had accumulated. He broke down crying during a phone call with his sister-in-law, Donna Amato, telling her he'd have to work several more years than planned before retirement. "But it's okay. I'll do it for Grant. I don't want him to go to jail." Rather than press charges, the family took shifts watching Donna Amato's home to prevent Grant from returning there and stealing more. On December 22, 2018, they surprised him in the driveway and drove him to a voluntary rehabilitation clinic in South Florida. They hoped treatment would help Grant overcome his addiction to the webcam model and get his life back on track. But Grant wasn't interested in rehabilitation. He continued trying to contact Sylvie, even from the treatment facility. His family set clear boundaries. He could return home only if he stopped all contact with the Bulgarian woman. Grant agreed, but he was lying. He'd hidden a cell phone and continued communicating with her. When Chad and Margaret discovered Grant was still contacting Sylvie, they confronted him. There was an argument. Grant was kicked out of the house. He went to stay elsewhere, but the family's attempt at tough love had come too late. Grant had made his decision about how to solve his problems. The murders were planned and methodical. On January 24, 2019, Grant returned to the family home in Chuluota while his parents were there. Margaret was working at her desk in the home office, focused on her computer. Grant approached from behind with a gun. He shot her in the back of the head. She died at her desk, never knowing her son had returned to kill her. Grant waited. He knew his father's schedule. When Chad came home, Grant shot him behind the ear. But the shot didn't immediately kill his father. Chad fell to the kitchen floor and tried to crawl away, desperately attempting to escape his son. Grant stood over him and shot him again. Chad Amato died on his kitchen floor, shot twice by the son he'd sacrificed his retirement to protect. Then came the longest wait. Grant knew his brother Cody would be returning from his shift at Orlando Regional Medical Center. Hours passed. Grant remained in the house with his parents' bodies, preparing his staging of the crime scene. He placed a gun near Cody's eventual location. He put a holster on Chad's body, positioning it in a way that would suggest Chad was left-handed, even though he was right-handed. The scene was meant to look like Cody had killed his parents and would be found having killed himself. When Cody finally arrived home around 11:30 p.m., Grant shot him in the face immediately upon entry. Cody, the successful brother, the nurse anesthetist who'd achieved everything Grant hadn't, was killed instantly. His girlfriend, Sloan Young, testified that she'd been texting with Cody up until the moment prosecutors believed he died. One moment he was alive, communicating normally. The next, he was gone. Grant then did something that revealed his true priorities. He used his dead father's fingerprint to unlock Chad's phone. He accessed the family's bank accounts and began transferring and withdrawing money. Even with 3 family members dead around him, Grant was focused on getting cash, presumably to continue paying Sylvie. After staging the murder-suicide scene, Grant fled. He drove to a DoubleTree hotel in Orange County and checked in. He searched online for top news stories, seeing reports about deaths at his family's home. Rather than turn himself in or show any remorse, he stayed at the hotel, waiting. The bodies were discovered on January 25th when Cody failed to show up for work. His employer called for a welfare check. Deputy Todd Moderson arrived at the Chulwota home around 9 a.m. and knocked on doors, called phones, even used an air horn. No response. When officers entered, they found the massacre. Chad was in the kitchen. Margaret was at her desk. Cody was in a storage room. All three had been shot in the head. Investigators quickly identified Grant as a suspect. His yellow Accord was tracked to the Doubletree Hotel, where he was arrested approximately 24 hours after the murders. He was taken in for questioning, and his story fell apart under interrogation. He claimed he'd been at the house and saw police and news vans, but instead of going inside or reporting to authorities, he went to Panera Bread and searched for top news stories. The behavior made no sense for an innocent person. His brother Jason tried to get Grant to confess during the interrogation, asking him to tell the truth about what happened. Grant was unwavering in his claims of innocence. He maintained he had nothing to do with the murders, that he loved his family, and that investigators were wrong. The trial began in July 2019. The prosecution presented a clear motive. Grant had killed his family after they'd cut off his access to money and forced him to stop contact with Sylvie. He wanted to inherit the family's assets so he could continue funding his obsession. Assistant State Attorney Dominic Leo asked the jury, if not Grant, then who? The evidence was substantial. Grant's DNA and presence at the scene, his motive based on the financial cutoff, his knowledge as a nurse about how to avoid leaving evidence, the timeline that matched his movements, the staged crime scene that made no sense, the gun placement, the holster positioning, the complete lack of forensic evidence suggesting anyone else had been there. Cell phone records and laptop activity that tracked Grant's actions. The defense, led by attorney Jeff Doughty, argued there was no physical evidence directly linking Grant to pulling the trigger. They claimed the investigation had focused too quickly on Grant and ignored other possibilities, but they couldn't explain away the motive, the opportunity, the staging, or Grant's suspicious behavior after the murders. On July 31, 2019, the jury found Grant Amato guilty of 3 counts of first-degree premeditated murder. His reaction during the medical examiner's testimony provided one of the trial's most striking moments. Grant watched in tears as photos of his dead family members were shown and their injuries explained. Was he feeling remorse, or was he simply upset at being caught? The penalty phase began on August 12th. The prosecution sought the death penalty. Grant's brother Jason testified against him, describing the impact of losing 3 family members. 3 people testified on Grant's behalf, but their efforts weren't enough to sway the entire jury. In Florida, a death sentence requires a unanimous jury recommendation. Grant's jury deadlocked. They couldn't reach unanimous agreement to recommend death. Under Florida law, when a jury cannot unanimously recommend death, the defendant automatically receives life in prison without the possibility of parole. On August 12, 2019, Grant Amato was sentenced to life. Imprisonment for each of the 3 murders. He would never walk free again. The family he'd destroyed was gone. Chad, who'd mortgaged his future to save his son. Margaret, who'd worked hard and tried to support Grant through his problems. Cody, whose only crime was being the successful brother living in the same house and coming home from work that night. All 3 were killed over Grant's obsession with a webcam model in Bulgaria who'd never met him and never would. Sylvia Venceslavova was never charged with any crime. From her perspective, she was simply doing her job as a webcam performer. A client was paying for her time and content. She didn't tell Grant to steal from his family. She didn't instruct him to commit murder. She was performing a service, and he was a customer who paid. The obsession was entirely Grant's creation. The case highlighted the dangers of parasocial relationships in the digital age, the illusion of connection with someone who doesn't actually know you. Grant convinced himself that Sylvie cared about him, that they had a relationship, that she was waiting for him. In reality, she was a performer with many clients, and Grant was just another username sending money. The fantasy he'd built was entirely one-sided. Grant's family had tried everything. They'd covered his debts. They'd forced him into treatment. They'd set boundaries and conditions. They'd given him chance after chance to change course. But Grant's obsession overrode everything: family loyalty, gratitude, basic morality, and self-preservation. When the money was cut off, he chose murder. But the story doesn't end with Grant's life sentence. In March 2025, new charges emerged that shocked even those familiar with his case. While incarcerated at Okeechobee Correctional Institution, Grant became involved in a murder-for-hire plot. He'd been contacted by Victoria Goodwin, wife of Aaron Goodwin, host of the reality TV show Ghost Adventures. Victoria had discovered Grant through a true crime documentary about his case. She began writing to him in May 2024, describing their relationship as pen pals. According to Las Vegas Metro Police Department arrest reports, the correspondence evolved into something more. Victoria and Grant claimed to be in love, and together they plotted to have Aaron Goodwin killed. Text messages seized from Grant's contraband cell phone showed him coordinating with an alleged hitman. Victoria allegedly set aside over $11,000 to pay for her husband's murder. Grant sent messages asking for updates. "He is asleep right now in the hotel room. Brother, I need to know what is going on. Can I get an update? Was it done?" Victoria Goodwin was arrested and charged with solicitation to commit murder and conspiracy to commit murder. She's being held in Clark County, Nevada. Grant faces potential additional charges. The Florida Department of Corrections maintains a strict zero-tolerance policy on cell phones in prison, but somehow Grant had obtained one and was using it to commit new crimes. The murder-for-hire plot revealed that Grant Amato had learned nothing from destroying his family. He showed no rehabilitation, no remorse, no change. Even facing life in prison for killing 3 people, he was willing to participate in planning another murder. The obsessive, entitled mindset that led him to steal $200,000 and commit familicide was still operating years later. Criminal defense attorney David Haas noted that if Grant is convicted in the new case, his sentence could be modified. It really depends on what, if anything, they're going to charge him with, or whether or not he's going to play a role as a witness in the case. You can give anybody more than life in prison. For Cody's girlfriend Sloan Young, for Grant's surviving brother Jason, for the extended Amato family, the new charges reopened wounds that had never fully healed. The man who'd killed their loved ones was still dangerous, still manipulative, still willing to destroy lives for his own gratification. Chad, Margaret, and Cody Amato died for $200,000 spent on a webcam model. They died because Grant's obsession mattered more to him than their lives. They died because an adult son, given every opportunity and support, chose theft and murder over honesty and change. Their family home on Sultan Circle became a crime scene. Their final moments were filled with betrayal and violence from the person who should have protected and honored them. Grant Amato will die in prison. That much is certain. But even behind bars, he continues to cause harm, plotting murders and manipulating others. The nurses at Advent Health, who suspected him of stealing medication, were right to report him. The family members who tried to intervene were right to set boundaries, but they were too late, too trusting, too willing to give one more chance to someone who would ultimately take everything: their money, their peace, and finally their lives. Case 6. Christopher Porco. In the quiet suburb of Delmar, New York, just outside Albany, the Porco family lived on a tree-lined street where the biggest problems were usually teenage drinking and the occasional burglary. Peter Porco, 52, worked as a law clerk for the State Appellate Division Court. His wife, Joan, 47, was a children's speech pathologist. They had 2 sons, Jonathan, who was serving in the Navy, and Christopher, 21, who attended the University of Rochester. From the outside, they appeared to be a typical middle-class family working hard and supporting their children's education. But Christopher Porco was living a double life built entirely on deception. And when his parents began discovering the truth, he made a decision that would leave one of them dead and the other permanently disfigured. Christopher's problems had started years earlier. In the fall of 2003, he'd been forced to withdraw from the University of Rochester due to failing grades. Rather than tell his parents the truth, he concocted an elaborate story. He claimed a professor had lost one of his final exams, and the university had made a mistake. He enrolled at Hudson Valley Community College for the spring 2004 semester, supposedly to rebuild his academic standing while the Rochester situation was resolved. But Christopher failed all his classes at the community college too. Again, he lied to his parents about his performance. When he reapplied to the University of Rochester for fall 2004, he submitted forged transcripts showing excellent grades from Hudson Valley. The forgery worked, and he was readmitted to Rochester. To pay for his return to the university, Christopher forged his father's signature on a loan application for $31,000. He also forged documents to obtain a car loan, purchasing a bright yellow Jeep Wrangler that would later become crucial evidence. Peter Porco had no idea his name was being used to secure these loans until credit institutions began contacting him about the debt. When Peter discovered what his son had done, he was furious and heartbroken. In early November 2004, he sent Christopher a series of emails confronting him about the forgeries. "Did you forge my signature as a co-signer?" Peter wrote. "What the hell are you doing? I'm calling Citibank this morning to find out what you have done." Christopher didn't respond to his father's calls. Peter sent another message. "I want you to know that if you abuse my credit again, I will be forced to file forgery affidavits." But then, revealing the conflicted feelings of a father who still loved his son, despite everything, Peter added, "We may be disappointed with you, but your mother and I still love you and care about your future." Joan also sent messages expressing the family's distress. She wrote to Christopher about their frustration with his lies. "Your father and I are extremely upset with your lies. Dad is about to have a nervous breakdown." Less than 2 weeks after these confrontational emails, Peter Porco would be dead, and Joan would be fighting for her life. On the night of November 14, 2004, Christopher was at the University of Rochester, 230 miles from his parents' home. Security cameras captured his distinctive yellow Jeep leaving campus late that evening. Toll collectors on the New York State Thruway reported seeing a similar yellow Jeep traveling toward Albany in the early morning hours of November 15th. Christopher arrived in Del Mar in the middle of the night. He knew the security system's master code. Only family members had access to that code. He disabled the alarm and cut the phone line outside the house. Then he retrieved a fireman's axe from the family garage, the same garage where he'd cut a screen on a window to suggest a break-in. Around 2 a.m., Christopher crept into his parents' bedroom. Peter and Joan were asleep, vulnerable and trusting. Christopher raised the axe and began swinging. Peter suffered 16 wounds to his head from the axe blows. The injuries were catastrophic. His skull was fractured in multiple places, brain tissue was exposed, and the damage should have killed him within minutes. Joan received similar devastating injuries. Her skull was fractured, her left eye was destroyed, her jaw was crushed, and teeth were knocked out. Blood saturated the master bedroom, covering the walls, the bed, and the floor. The axe was left at the foot of the bed. Christopher got back in his yellow Jeep and drove to Rochester, apparently believing he'd left both parents dead or dying. But what happened next would become one of the most disturbing and medically remarkable aspects of the case. Peter Porco did not immediately die from his injuries. Despite having his skull fractured in 16 places, despite having catastrophic brain damage that had exposed brain tissue, Peter woke up. Operating on nothing but adrenaline and some primitive survival instinct, completely unaware of the severity of his injuries or what had happened to him, Peter Porco began his morning routine. He got out of bed, leaving a trail of blood as he moved. He went to the kitchen and attempted to make his son's lunch, the son who had just tried to kill him. He wrote a check for Christopher, something he'd apparently planned to do that day, and left it on the counter, covered in his own blood. He tried to load the dishwasher. He attempted to get dressed. Blood sprayed across walls and doorways as Peter stumbled through his home, his body still functioning even as his brain was dying. Medical examiner officials would later testify that Peter was operating entirely on adrenaline and was almost certainly unaware of his condition or surroundings. He was essentially a walking corpse, his body going through learned routines while his brain ceased to function. Eventually, Peter collapsed in the foyer of his home. He died there, hours after the attack, having spent his final moments unknowingly preparing for a day that would never come. Meanwhile, Joan lay in the blood-soaked master bedroom barely alive. When court officer Michael Hart arrived at the Porco residence around 11:35 a.m. to check on Peter, who'd failed to show up for work at the courthouse, he discovered the horror. Peter's body in the foyer, blood throughout the house, and Joan somehow still clinging to life despite devastating injuries. Paramedic Kevin Robert found Joan on her back, her left eye missing, jaw crushed, teeth gone, and skull fractured in several places. "There is blood all over the master bed, just covered, saturated," he testified. "There is blood on the walls behind the bed." Detective Chris Bowdish arrived at the scene and made his way to Joan. She was conscious, though barely. In what would become the most controversial moment of the entire case, Bowdish asked Joan if she could hear him. She nodded yes. Then he asked her a direct question. "Do you know who did this to you?" According to Bowdish and other officers present, when he asked if Christopher was responsible, Joan nodded her head yes. Joan was rushed to the hospital and placed in a medically induced coma. Her injuries were so severe that doctors weren't sure she would survive. When she eventually emerged from the coma months later, Joan made a stunning claim. She had no memory of the attack or its aftermath, including her reported identification of Christopher as the attacker. More than that, Joan became her son's most passionate defender. She insisted Christopher was innocent. She urged authorities to search for her husband's real killer. Throughout Christopher's trial and for years afterward, Joan maintained that her son could never have done this to them. She sat in court behind Christopher, hugging him before and after each session, publicly supporting him despite having survived his attempt to kill her. The prosecution built their case on circumstantial evidence. Christopher's yellow Jeep had been seen leaving Rochester and traveling toward Albany. Toll booth records placed a similar vehicle on the route. Neighbors reported seeing a yellow Jeep in the Porco driveway early that morning. The security alarm had been disabled with the master code that only family members knew. The phone line had been cut. Christopher had motive. His parents had discovered his forgeries and lies, and Peter had threatened legal action. Christopher's defense team, led by attorneys Terrence Kindlin and Lori Shanks, argued that the investigation had focused too quickly on Christopher and ignored other possibilities. They pointed out that no fingerprints were found on the axe. They suggested Peter's uncle, Frank Porco, who'd been a captain in the Bonanno crime family, might be connected. The murder weapon being a fireman's axe seemed symbolic, they argued, given Frank's nickname, the Fireman. But the defense couldn't explain away the evidence. Christopher's Jeep on the road that night, disabled alarm that required the master code, the forged loans providing motive, the confrontational emails from his parents just days before, the check Peter had written for Christopher covered in blood found in the kitchen. the timing that placed Christopher at the scene. Most damaging of all was Joan's initial identification of Christopher as the attacker, even though she later recanted. Prosecutors argued that Joan's first response, before she had time to process the horror or feel conflicted about identifying her son, was the truth. Her later defense of Christopher, they suggested, came from a mother's inability to accept that her son had tried to kill her and had murdered her husband. On August 10, 2006, after hearing weeks of testimony, the jury convicted 23-year-old Christopher Porco of second-degree murder for killing his father and attempted murder for attacking his mother. Orange County Judge Jeffrey G. Berry sentenced Christopher to 50 years to life on each count, to be served concurrently. Christopher wouldn't be eligible for parole until 2052, when he'd be 69 years old. Christopher maintained his innocence at sentencing, asking the court to find the real killers. Judge Berry rejected this plea, telling Christopher he had violated one of life's most sacred bonds by attacking his parents with an axe as they slept. The judge noted that Peter and Joan had been found in their bedroom, a place where they should have been safest, and that Peter had spent his final hours stumbling through his home, unaware he was dying, trying to complete mundane tasks while his blood drained away. Joan Porco never wavered in her support of Christopher. Despite losing her left eye, suffering permanent facial disfigurement, and requiring extensive reconstructive surgery, despite being told by police that she'd identified her son as the attacker, Joan insisted Christopher was innocent. She testified at his trial, sitting just feet from him, accusing police of bungling the investigation and charging the wrong person. The psychology of Joan's position fascinated observers. Was she truly unable to remember those crucial moments when she'd nodded to identify Christopher? Or was the truth so unbearable that her son had tried to kill her and had murdered her husband, that she'd created a false narrative to preserve some version of family? Mental health experts noted that trauma victims sometimes experience genuine memory loss, but they also noted that denial can be a powerful psychological defense mechanism. Christopher has filed multiple appeals over the years, all unsuccessful. In 2022, he filed a motion for a new trial, claiming his defense attorneys had been ineffective and had lost crucial paperwork that could exonerate him. In 2023, he told a reporter that he believes this new motion will overturn his conviction. The courts have yet to be persuaded. Christopher remains incarcerated at Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, New York, a maximum security prison in the Adirondack Mountains. He's now in his 40s, having spent nearly 2 decades behind bars. His mother continues to believe in his innocence, or at least claims to. The case became the subject of numerous true crime programs and a 2013 Lifetime movie. The image of Peter Porco stumbling through his home for hours with catastrophic brain injuries, writing checks, and making lunch while unaware he was dying became one of the most haunting aspects of American true crime history. Medical professionals still cite the case when discussing the human body's ability to function on adrenaline even after sustaining fatal injuries. Peter Porco never got to see his son Jonathan advance in his Navy career or start a family. He never got to retire from his position at the courthouse. His final hours were spent in confusion and pain, his body operating on autopilot while his brain died, completely unaware that the son he'd loved and supported had been the one who'd destroyed him. Joan Porco lost her husband, her left eye, part of her skull, and much of her face. She underwent numerous surgeries and can only read with a large magnifying glass. She lost her sense of normalcy and security, and she lives with a terrible choice: believe her son is innocent and that the real killer remains free, or accept that the child she raised tried to murder her and succeeded in murdering her husband. She chose the former, whether out of genuine belief or psychological necessity, and that choice has defined the rest of her life. Christopher Porco's lies about college, his forged loans, his academic failures, these were problems that could have been solved. He could have dropped out and gotten a job. He could have admitted his failures and faced consequences. He could have apologized and worked to rebuild trust. Instead, he drove 230 miles in the middle of the night, disabled his family's security system, retrieved an axe from the garage, and tried to murder both of his parents in their sleep. For the sake of maintaining a lie about college attendance and avoiding responsibility for forged loans, Christopher Porco destroyed his family. His father died after hours of unknowing suffering. His mother was permanently disfigured and traumatized. His brother lost both parents, one to death, one to denial. And Christopher himself threw away his entire life, ensuring he'd spend his best years and likely die in a maximum security prison. The yellow Jeep, the forged documents, the confrontational emails, the disabled alarm, the axe left at the scene, all of it pointed to a young man who'd built a life on lies and chose violence when those lies were exposed. The jury believed it, the judge believed it, but Joan Porco never did or never could. And that tragedy, a mother unable or unwilling to accept what her son had done, remains as haunting as anything else about the case. Case 7. Thomas Art Whitaker. The Whitaker family embodied the American dream. Kent Whitaker worked as the comptroller of a construction company, providing a comfortable life for his family in Sugar Land, an affluent suburb southwest of Houston. His wife, Patricia, known to everyone as Tricia, was an elementary school teacher who'd left her career to focus on raising their 2 sons. The family lived in a beautiful home, attended church regularly, and seemed to have everything going for them. Their oldest son, Thomas Bartlett Whitaker, called Bart by everyone, was the golden child. He'd attended Baylor University and transferred to Sam Houston State University, where his parents believed he was thriving academically. In December 2003, Bart announced exciting news. He'd completed his final exams and would be graduating. Kent and Tricia couldn't have been prouder. To honor the occasion, they presented their 23-year-old son with a $4,000 Rolex watch. But every single detail was a lie. Bart had dropped out of Sam Houston State months earlier, or had never progressed beyond freshman status with academic probation. Reports varied. He'd been lying to his parents about his enrollment for years, creating elaborate stories to explain why they couldn't attend campus events or verify his progress. The graduation was fake. The Rolex was a gift based on a deception, and the celebration dinner that night would end in bloodshed. What Kent and Tricia didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that this wasn't Bart's first attempt to kill his family. It was his third. In December 2000, while at Baylor University, Bart had approached a fellow student named Will Anthony with a murder-for-hire proposal. He wanted Anthony to kill his family so he could inherit their estate. Anthony refused, and the plot went nowhere. In April 2001, Bart tried again, recruiting his Baylor roommate Justin Peters and another friend, Adam Hipp. The plan was detailed and specific. Bart would take his family out to dinner, leaving a door unlocked. Hipp would enter the house, armed with a pistol that Peters would drive down from Waco. When the family returned, Hipp would be waiting in the dining room. He would shoot them as they entered the foyer. Kent, Tricia, and Kevin would all be killed. Bart would be shot in the arm to make himself appear a victim rather than a suspect. Adam Hipp drew diagrams of the plan for Bart, showing stick figures of the shooter in the dining room and 3 stick figure bodies in the front foyer. But this plot also fell apart. The friend who was supposed to provide the gun backed out. The plan never progressed beyond the preparation stage, but Bart didn't give up. He simply waited for another opportunity. By 2003, Bart was living in a townhouse in Willis, Texas, that his parents had purchased for him. He shared the space with a 21-year-old friend named Chris Brashear, whom he'd met working at Bentwater Country Club, Another friend, Stephen Champagne, was also part of Bart's social circle. And in late summer 2003, Bart began testing the waters again. He started making jokes to Champagne and Brashear about wanting his family killed, gauging their reactions. The comments escalated. In September 2003, Bart directly asked Champagne to shoot his family when they returned from some function. Champagne testified at trial that he eventually confronted Bart publicly, hoping that making a scene would get Bart to leave him alone about the murder plot. Shortly after that confrontation, Bart invited Chris Brashear to move into the townhouse. The discussions about killing the Whitaker family continued. Champagne later testified that he agreed to be the getaway driver when Bart told him he was already guilty of conspiracy to commit the crime. Bart had manipulated him into believing he had no choice but to participate. The plan was set for December 10, 2003. Bart told his parents he would be graduating from Sam Houston State, providing the perfect pretext to get the family out of the house for a celebration. The day before the planned murders, Bart had an argument with his father. Kent had begun suspecting something wasn't right about Bart's academic claims. He was asking questions, wanting to verify details. The pressure was mounting, and Bart knew his lies would soon be exposed. On the evening of December 10th, the Whitaker family gathered for what they believed was a celebration of Bart's achievement. Kent, Tricia, Kevin, and Bart drove to Pappadeaux, a popular Cajun restaurant in Stafford. They took photos over dinner, images that would later be shown at trial, showing the family smiling and celebrating together, completely unaware that one of them was hours away from orchestrating their murders. The family laughed, enjoyed congratulatory dessert, and reveled in what they thought was Bart's success. Kent and Tricia beamed with pride. Kevin, 19 years old and himself a student, celebrated his older brother's graduation. Bart smiled for the camera, knowing that at that very moment, Chris Brashear was inside their home on Sultan Circle, waiting with a gun. Brashear had entered the house earlier that day using Bart's key. He'd gone to Kevin's room and taken Kevin's own gun and ammunition from a locked box. He staged a burglary, pulling out drawers evenly, not haphazardly like a real burglary, but methodically. Then he positioned himself near the front door and waited. When the family returned home around 8:45 p.m., Bart said he needed to get his cell phone from his parked Yukon SUV in the driveway. It was a prearranged signal, a final confirmation to Brashear that the family was about to enter. Bart ran down the driveway, ostensibly to retrieve his phone, but really to distance himself from the front door and appear innocent. Kevin opened the door first. According to Kent's later testimony, Kevin stepped inside and was shot. The bullet struck him in the chest. He fell immediately. 19-year-old Kevin Whitaker, who'd smiled at dinner just an hour earlier, was dying on his foyer floor. Tricia was next. She stepped up to the door, was shot, Kent recalled. The bullet hit her in the chest as well. She collapsed near her younger son. Kent looked into the door and was shot behind the ear. The bullet shattered his humerus bone in his shoulder. He fell but remained conscious. Through the chaos and pain, he heard Bart's voice yelling, claiming he was trying to catch the intruder. Bart ran into the house, wrestled briefly with Brashear, a staged confrontation, and allowed himself to be shot in the left arm. "It was to distance me from the guilt," Bart later told investigators during a jailhouse interview. "But also, I think, on an internal level, it was me realizing that there was no way that I could come out of this physically unscathed." Chris Brashear fled through the back door, leaping over the fence into the neighboring yard. Stephen Champagne was waiting in the getaway car. As they drove away, Champagne asked what happened. Brashear told him he'd shot all of them. A neighbor, Brandon Stanley, heard the gunshots and called 911. He rushed over and found Kent conscious and calling for help. "I was there when they died," Stanley later said. "That was real, and I can't necessarily make sense of what I saw." Emergency responders arrived within minutes. Kevin was dead where he fell, a single bullet in his chest. He died within moments of being shot. Tricia was airlifted to Memorial Hermann Hospital, but died from her injuries shortly after arrival. Kent, despite being shot and suffering a shattered shoulder, survived. Bart, with his carefully staged arm wound, was treated for non-life-threatening injuries. Initially, investigators treated the case as a home invasion gone wrong. The staged burglary, the seemingly random violence, it appeared to be an armed intruder scenario. But almost immediately, things didn't add up. Electronics and valuables were left in place. The drawers were pulled out too evenly. And the family members were shot with precision, targeted execution style rather than in a chaotic struggle. Then came the break investigators needed. On December 15, 2003, just 5 days after the murders, a man named Adam Hipp walked into the Sugar Land Police Department asking to speak with Detective Marshall Slott. Hipp had attended high school with Bart, and he had an extraordinary story to tell. Hipp explained that in the spring of 2001, Bart had recruited him to kill the Whitaker family. Hipp drew a diagram showing exactly where the shooter would stand and where the bodies would fall. The diagram matched the actual crime scene almost perfectly. Hipp detailed how Bart planned to be shot in the arm to avoid suspicion. He explained the motive. Bart wanted to inherit his parents' share of the family construction business and their estate. Detective Slott initially thought Hipp might be the shooter, but Hipp's alibi checked out. He'd been at work at a Dallas bank with documented clock-out times proving he couldn't have been in Sugar Land that night. Slott then tracked down Justin Peters, Bart's former Baylor roommate, in San Antonio. Peters confirmed the 2001 plot and revealed there had also been a December 2000 attempt involving Will Anthony. The pattern was undeniable. Bart had been trying to kill his family for 3 years. He'd approached multiple people with nearly identical plans. Each time the plot was the same. Take the family to dinner, have someone waiting inside, shoot them as they entered, shoot Bart in a non-lethal location to make him appear a victim. The December 10, 2003 attack wasn't an aberration. It was the culmination of years of planning and failed attempts. Investigators learned that Bart was sharing his townhouse with Chris Brashear. When they interviewed Stephen Champagne, he eventually admitted his role as getaway driver. Champagne described how Bart had gradually recruited them, testing their willingness, manipulating them into believing they were already guilty of conspiracy. On the night of the murders, Champagne had waited in the car, while Brashear entered the house and carried out the shootings. Kent Whitaker was still recovering from his gunshot wound when he learned his oldest son was not just a suspect, but the mastermind. The son he'd raised, supported, given a Rolex watch to that very day, had orchestrated the murders of his wife and younger son. Kent had survived only because the bullet missed vital areas. If Brashear's aim had been slightly different, Kent would have died too, leaving Bart to inherit everything as the sole survivor. The motive became clear. Bart wanted his freedom and his family's money. He'd been living a lie about college, and that lie was becoming harder to maintain. His father was asking questions, but beyond the immediate pressure, Bart simply wanted the lifestyle his parents' estate could provide without having to answer to them or live under their expectations. If they were dead, he'd be a wealthy young man with no one to disappoint and no one to answer to. Bart Whitaker was arrested and charged with capital murder under Texas's law of parties. This law allows someone who didn't pull the trigger to be charged with murder if they orchestrated the crime. Since Bart had planned the murders, recruited the participants, and set the plan in motion, he was legally as responsible as Chris Brashear, who'd actually fired the shots. The trial began in March 2007. Prosecutor Fred Felkman and the state of Texas presented the evidence of years of planning, the multiple recruitment attempts, the diagrams, the timeline, and the testimonies of Adam Hipp, Justin Peters, Stephen Champagne, and others. The defense, led by attorney Randy McDonald, argued that the evidence didn't definitively prove Bart's guilt, but the mountain of testimony and circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. On March 2, 2007, the jury convicted Bart Whitaker of capital murder. Because the murders occurred during a robbery, theft of the family's property through inheritance, special circumstances applied, making Bart eligible for the death penalty. After the sentencing phase, the jury recommended death. Bart was sentenced to death row at Polunsky Unit near Livingston, Texas. Throughout the trial, Kent Whitaker did something extraordinary. Despite losing his wife and younger son, despite being shot himself, Kent asked the jury not to give Bart the death penalty. He testified about his belief in redemption and forgiveness. He explained that executing Bart would make him lose his last remaining immediate family member. The jury didn't accept his plea. Kent didn't give up. Over the next 11 years, while Bart sat on death row, Kent became an advocate for his son's life. He wrote a book titled Murder by Family, the incredible true story of a son's treachery and a father's forgiveness. He visited Bart regularly in prison. He publicly forgave his son for orchestrating the murders of Tricia and Kevin. "I have seen too much killing already," Kent told reporters. "I don't want to see him executed right there in front of my eyes." Kent's advocacy focused on several points. He noted that Chris Brashear, who actually pulled the trigger and killed Tricia and Kevin, had pleaded guilty to murder in 2007 and received a life sentence with the possibility of parole. Meanwhile, Bart, who hadn't fired the shots, received the death penalty. Kent argued this disparity was unjust under the law of parties. More importantly, Kent argued from a victim's perspective. He was the greatest victim in the case. He'd been shot, lost his wife, lost his younger son, and survived to testify. As the primary victim, he believed his wishes should matter. He didn't want Bart executed. He wanted the chance to maintain some relationship with his only surviving immediate family member. As Bart's execution date approached, February 26, 2018, Kent intensified his campaign. He filed a petition for clemency with the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles. The 7-member board voted unanimously to recommend commuting Bart's sentence from death to life without parole. This recommendation went to Texas Governor Greg Abbott, who had the final decision. Governor Abbott was known as a strong supporter of the death penalty. In his first 3 years as governor, he'd allowed 30 executions to proceed without granting any commutations. The likelihood of him sparing Bart seemed low. Kent prepared to witness his son's execution, planning to be in the room with Bart during his final moments. "As he goes to sleep, I want him to be able to look at me and see that I love him," Kent said. On February 22, 2018, Bart was prepared for execution. Lethal injection drugs were ready. Media witnesses had assembled. Kent was present, bracing himself to watch his son die. The execution was scheduled for 6:00 p.m. At 5:20 p.m., just 40 minutes before the scheduled execution, Governor Abbott announced his decision. He would grant clemency. Bart's death sentence would be commuted to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In his statement, Abbott explained his reasoning. He noted that this was the first commutation he'd granted since becoming governor, despite allowing 30 executions. He acknowledged the disparity between Brashear's sentence, life with parole possibility, and Bart's death, even though Brashear had pulled the trigger. Most significantly, Abbott cited Kent Whitaker's wishes as a primary factor. "Mr. Whitaker's father, who survived the attempt on his life, passionately opposes the execution of his son," Abbott wrote. "Mr. Whitaker's father insists that he would be victimized again if the state put to death his last remaining immediate family member." Abbott also noted that Bart had voluntarily waived all future claims for parole in exchange for the commutation. Bart would spend the rest of his life in prison. There would be no possibility of release, no parole hearings, no chance of freedom. But he would live. When told of the governor's decision, Bart's first words were, "I'm thankful not for me, but for my dad. Any punishment that I would have or will receive is just, but my dad did nothing wrong. The system worked for him today, and I will do my best to uphold my role in the system." Bart was transferred from death row to general population at the McConnell unit near Beeville, Texas. In prison, he's taught himself Spanish and now teaches English to Spanish-speaking inmates. He helps fellow prisoners earn their high school diplomas. He's participated in educational programs and, by all accounts, has made genuine efforts at rehabilitation. Kent continues to visit his son regularly. He maintains that Bart has changed, that he's genuinely remorseful, that he's become a different person than the young man who orchestrated his family's murder. "I have seen such change in him," Kent has said publicly. The case raises profound questions about justice, forgiveness, and victims' rights. Kent Whitaker experienced unimaginable trauma. Watching his wife die, losing his younger son, surviving a gunshot wound, discovering his oldest son masterminded it all. Yet Kent chose forgiveness over vengeance. He fought for years to save Bart's life, ultimately succeeding in a state that rarely grants clemency. But what about Tricia and Kevin? They don't have a voice in whether Bart should live or die. Tricia was 51 years old when she was shot in her own foyer, killed by a plan her son had orchestrated. Kevin was 19, with his whole life ahead of him, shot in the chest the moment he opened his front door. Their wishes about justice were silenced by Bart's plot. Some victims' family members disagreed with Kent's stance. But under Texas law, Kent, as the surviving victim, had significant moral authority. His forgiveness campaign raised the question, whose voice matters most in determining punishment? The dead victims who can't speak? The surviving victim who was shot? The extended family members who lost loved ones? Society at large? The law of parties that convicted Bart is itself controversial. Under this statute, someone who plans a murder but doesn't commit it can receive a harsher sentence than the person who pulls the trigger. Chris Brashear killed Tricia and Kevin with his own hands, yet he received life with possible parole. Bart orchestrated the murders but was sentenced to death, later commuted to life without parole. Prosecutor Felkman defended this disparity, arguing that masterminds bear greater responsibility than those they manipulate or recruit. But others questioned whether the law created unjust outcomes. Bart's case became a focal point in debates about proportional sentencing, the death penalty, and redemption. Supporters of the commutation pointed to Bart's prison conduct, his educational efforts, and his father's forgiveness. Opponents argued that orchestrating 3 separate murder attempts over 3 years, finally succeeding in killing 2 family members, warranted the ultimate punishment regardless of subsequent rehabilitation. The Whitaker family's story is ultimately about the limits and possibilities of forgiveness. Kent lost everything: his wife of decades, his younger son, his sense of safety, his intact family. He was shot and traumatized, yet he chose to forgive Bart and fight for his life. That choice doesn't erase what Bart did or bring back Tricia and Kevin, but it represents a father's extraordinary capacity for grace. Tricia Whitaker never got to retire from teaching or enjoy her later years. Kevin never got to finish college, start a career, fall in love, or have children. They were shot to death as they entered their own home after celebrating what they believed was their son and brother's graduation. A graduation that was entirely fake, part of a web of lies that had lasted years. Bart Whitaker orchestrated 3 murder attempts against his family. He lied about college for years. He recruited multiple friends to kill for him. He bought a Rolex with money meant to celebrate a fake graduation. He smiled at dinner while a hired killer waited at home. And when Chris Brashear pulled the trigger, killing Bart's mother and brother while wounding his father, Bart's plan had finally succeeded. Now Bart sits in a Texas prison, teaching Spanish to inmates, working on his rehabilitation, living because his father fought to save him. He'll never be free, he'll never attend a real graduation, have a family of his own, or live outside prison walls. But he's alive, and in a state that executes more inmates than any other. That itself is extraordinary. Kent Whitaker visits his son, maintaining a relationship despite everything. He's written about forgiveness, spoken about redemption, and become an advocate for understanding rather than vengeance. Whether this represents admirable grace or misplaced loyalty, only Kent can decide. What's certain is that his choice, to forgive Bart and fight for his life, saved his son from execution and sparked a national conversation about justice, punishment, and what victims truly need to heal. Case 8. Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk. In the small city of Pocatello, Idaho, where serious crime was rare and everyone seemed to know everyone else, September 22, 2006, began as an ordinary Friday. Students at Pocatello High School attended classes, made weekend plans, and looked forward to the break. Among them was Cassie Jo Stoddart, a 16-year-old junior known for being popular, reliable, and kind. That evening, she had plans to house-sit for her aunt and uncle, Allison and Frank Contreras, who were out of town for the weekend. Also at school that day were two 16-year-old boys named Brian Lee Draper and Tori Michael Adamczyk. They were friends, both interested in horror movies, and both planning something that would shock the community and the nation. Unlike most teenagers thinking about homework or weekend plans, Brian and Tori were thinking about murder, and they were documenting their intentions on video. The footage they recorded would become some of the most chilling evidence ever presented in a murder trial. In their homemade videos, Brian and Tori discussed their plan in detail, comparing themselves to famous killers, expressing excitement about taking a life, and treating the upcoming murder as if it were a film project rather than the ending of a real person's existence. On camera, they talked about how they wanted to be like the killers in the horror film Scream. They mentioned being inspired by Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, who'd carried out the Columbine High School massacre. They spoke with enthusiasm about becoming serial killers, dismissing other murderers as amateurs compared to what they planned to become. One of them said on tape, "I feel like I want to kill somebody. I know that's not normal, but what the hell?" The boys had been preparing for weeks. They'd purchased knives at a pawn shop in Pocatello. A friend named Matt Lucero later testified that he'd bought 4 knives for them for a total of $45, $40 from Brian, and $5 from Tori. One had a serrated blade, which Brian specifically claimed as his own. These weren't kitchen knives or pocket knives for camping. They were dagger-style hunting knives designed to inflict serious damage. Brian and Tori had even started what they called a death list, names of other potential victims they planned to target after their first kill. Cassie Jo Stoddart's name wasn't originally on any list. She wasn't chosen because of personal animosity or conflict. She was selected for the most chilling reason possible: opportunity. She would be alone in a house, isolated, vulnerable. She was convenient. That Friday evening, Cassie's boyfriend, Matt Beckham, arrived at the Contreras home around 6 p.m. The couple planned to spend time together while Cassie watched the house and took care of the family's pets. It was supposed to be a quiet, peaceful evening. Then, around 8:20 p.m., Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk showed up claiming they wanted to hang out. Cassie, being friendly and welcoming, invited them in. She gave them a tour of the house, including the basement. The 4 teenagers settled in to watch Kill Bill Volume 2 in the living room. Everything seemed normal, just high school friends spending a Friday night together. But around 9:30 p.m., Brian and Torrey said they were leaving to catch a movie at the theater. They left through the front door. Matt and Cassie continued watching their film, unaware that their friends hadn't actually left. Brian and Torrey had circled back. They'd unlocked a door during their visit, giving themselves a way back inside. Now they waited, preparing for what came next. As the evening progressed, something strange started happening. The lights in the house began turning on and off. The power flickered. Cassie and Matsy were confused and a bit unnerved, but they assumed it was an electrical problem. In reality, Brian and Torrey were outside, repeatedly tampering with the home's fuse box. They were intentionally frightening Cassie, creating an atmosphere of unease and fear. It was all part of their plan, drawn from horror movie tropes. Scare the victim first, then strike. Around 10:30 p.m., Matt's mother called, saying she needed him to come home to babysit his younger siblings. Matt was reluctant to leave Cassie alone, especially with the strange power issues, but his mother insisted. He kissed Cassie goodbye and left. She was now alone in the house, exactly as Brian and Torrey had planned. Cassie tried to settle in for the night, probably assuming she'd just watch TV and go to bed. She had no reason to fear anything serious. She was in her aunt and uncle's home, in a safe neighborhood in a quiet city. The power problems were strange but not terribly alarming. As Matt drove away, Cassie was alive, safe, and expecting a peaceful night of house-sitting. Brian and Torrey waited until they were certain Matt was gone and Cassie was alone. Then they entered the house through the door they'd unlocked. They wore dark clothing and masks to disguise their identities, just like the killers in Scream. They carried their knives. Their homemade horror movie was about to become real. What happened next was captured not on their camera, but in the physical evidence investigators would later find. Cassie fought for her life. The crime scene showed clear signs of a desperate struggle. She was stabbed approximately 30 times with at least 2 different knives, one with a serrated blade and others that were non-serrated. 12 of the wounds were potentially fatal. The attack was frenzied, brutal, and prolonged. Medical examiner testimony would later detail that Cassie suffered deep cuts across her body. The knife wound struck her trunk, her chest, vital organs. She was stabbed in the back, suggesting she'd tried to flee or protect herself. The serrated knife left distinctive marks. The violence was overwhelming and merciless. Cassie Jo Stoddart died on the living room floor of her aunt and uncle's home, murdered by 2 boys she'd considered friends, boys she'd welcomed into the house just hours earlier. She was 16 years old. She'd never graduate high school, never go to college, never fall in love or build a life. All of that potential was erased in a few minutes of horrific violence. After killing Cassie, Brian and Torrey fled through the back door of the house, jumping over a fence into a neighboring yard. Stephen Champagne was waiting in a getaway car, though there is no evidence Champagne knew about the murder beforehand. The boys had completed their mission, and they celebrated it on video. In footage recorded after the murder, Brian and Torrey discussed what they'd done. They expressed satisfaction. They talked about Cassie's death as if reviewing a completed project. They showed no remorse, no horror at what they'd done. Instead, they discussed their plans to kill again, to become the serial killers they'd fantasized about. The death list was ready for the next victim, but the boys made a crucial mistake. They tried to dispose of the evidence by burying it in a remote area near Black Rock Canyon. They buried the knives, the masks, the dark clothing they'd worn, and the videotape that documented their planning and aftermath. They attempted to burn the tape, but the fire didn't completely destroy it, and they didn't bury everything deep enough. On Sunday, September 24th, Allison and Frank Contreras returned home from their trip. Their 13-year-old daughter was the first to enter the house. She found Cassie on the living room floor, lying in a pool of blood. The family immediately called 911. When first responders and investigators arrived, they found a scene of devastating violence. It was clear that Cassie put up an extreme fight, Idaho State Police Captain John Gansky later told reporters. She fought for her life. The investigation began with Cassie's boyfriend, Matt Beckham. He was the last person known to have seen her alive. Police brought him in for questioning, but he quickly cooperated, passed a polygraph test, and provided information that shifted the investigation in a different direction. Matt told detectives that Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk had also been at the house that evening. They'd visited, watched part of the movie, and then claimed they were going to the theater. When detectives interviewed Brian and Tori, both boys provided the same story. They'd left Cassie's house and gone to watch the movie Pulse at the theater. But when asked to describe the film, neither could recall any details about the plot. Their alibi immediately fell apart. An employee at the movie theater who went to school with the boys confirmed that neither Brian nor Tori had been there that night. Detective Gansky knew they were lying. We knew that they were lying to us. Now we have to figure out, why are they lying to us? Confronted with the contradiction, the boys changed their story. They claimed they'd been breaking into cars in the area and hadn't wanted to admit it because they didn't want to get in trouble. But investigators didn't believe this explanation either. The lies were piling up and the boys' behavior was increasingly suspicious. Brian Draper eventually agreed to take a polygraph test scheduled for the next day. But before the test began, Brian became emotional and distraught. He asked to speak with detectives. With his parents present, Brian confessed, sort of. He admitted that he and Tori had returned to the Contreras house. He said they'd worn masks and turned off the power to frighten Cassie as a joke. But then, Brian claimed, he was shocked when Tori started stabbing her. According to Brian's version, it was supposed to be a joke. It wasn't supposed to happen. Brian led investigators to the burial site near Black Rock Canyon, where they'd hidden the evidence. Detectives found the knives, the masks, the clothing, and most damning of all, the partially burned videotape. Forensic technicians were able to restore much of the footage despite the fire damage. What they found on that tape would shock even experienced prosecutors and investigators. The video showed Brian and Tori planning the murder in advance, discussing their desire to kill, comparing themselves to famous murderers, and expressing excitement about becoming serial killers. The footage documented clear premeditation. This wasn't a spontaneous act or a joke gone wrong. This was planned, deliberate murder carried out for the thrill of killing. On September 27, 2006, both Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk were arrested and charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. Despite being 16 years old at the time of the crime, both were charged as adults. The trials were held separately. Brian Draper's trial began in April 2007. The prosecution presented the videotaped evidence, witness testimony, forensic evidence from the crime scene, and Brian's own confession. The videotapes were particularly devastating. The jury heard Brian and Tori discussing murder as if it were entertainment, expressing their desire to kill, and planning Cassie's death. They saw the boys' excitement and lack of remorse. Brian's defense team argued that he'd been influenced by Tori and hadn't actually done the stabbing himself. But the videotapes showed Brian as an equal participant in planning and executing the crime. The jury deliberated and found Brian Draper guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Tori Adamczyk's trial began in June 2007. His defense faced the same overwhelming evidence: the videotapes, the testimony, the physical evidence. Tori's attorneys tried to argue that Brian had been the primary aggressor and that Tori had been swept along. But again, the videos contradicted this narrative, showing both boys as willing and enthusiastic participants. The jury found Torrey guilty on both counts. On August 21, 2007, both Brian Draper and Torrey Adamczyk appeared for sentencing. Despite their youth, they were 17 years old by this point, both received adult sentences. Each was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder charge, plus an additional 30 years to life for the conspiracy charge. They would spend the rest of their lives behind bars. The sentences sparked debate about juvenile justice and whether 16-year-olds should be sentenced to life without parole. Some argued that teenagers' brains aren't fully developed and that even those who commit terrible crimes have capacity for change and rehabilitation. Others pointed to the calculated premeditation, the videotaped evidence of planning, and the sheer brutality of stabbing a friend 30 times, arguing that some crimes are so heinous that age shouldn't matter. Both Brian and Torrey filed appeals over the years, arguing that their sentences were unconstitutional or that their trials had been flawed. All appeals were denied. The Idaho Supreme Court upheld their convictions and sentences, noting that the evidence of premeditation was overwhelming and that the crimes warranted the punishment imposed. Brian Draper is currently incarcerated at the Idaho State Correctional Institution in Kuna, Idaho. Torrey Adamczyk is serving his sentence at the Saguaro Correctional Center in Arizona. Neither will ever be released from prison. They'll grow old behind bars, aging from teenagers to middle-aged men to elderly inmates, all within prison walls. The impact on Pocatello and the surrounding community was profound. Parents struggled to understand how two seemingly normal teenage boys could plan and execute such a brutal murder. Teachers and school officials questioned what warning signs they might have missed. Students who'd known Brian, Torrey, and Cassie were traumatized by the loss and the betrayal. Cassie's family was devastated. They'd lost a beloved daughter, niece, and granddaughter to a senseless act of violence. To honor her memory, Cassie's grandmother started Pumpkins for Cassie, a fundraiser where community members could donate to the Pocatello Animal Shelter or Idaho Food Bank and receive a pumpkin. The initiative became an annual tradition, keeping Cassie's memory alive and turning tragedy into something that helped others. The funeral for Cassie Jo Stoddart was held on October 1, 2006, and was attended by 500 people. The community turned out to mourn a young life cut short and to support a family shattered by violence. In a small city like Pocatello, where violent crime was rare, Cassie's murder represented a loss of innocence and safety. The case became known nationally as the Scream Killers because of Brian and Torrey's stated inspiration from the horror film. It's been featured on numerous true crime programs, including Dateline with Keith Morrison. The self-documented nature of the crime, teenagers filming themselves planning a murder, made it particularly disturbing and memorable. Psychologists and criminologists have studied the case, trying to understand what drives adolescents to commit thrill killings. Brian and Torrey weren't motivated by revenge, financial gain, or self-defense. They didn't have a grudge against Cassie. They killed her because they wanted to know what it felt like to kill. They wanted to live out a horror movie fantasy. They wanted to become the serial killers they admired. The influence of violent media on impressionable minds became part of the public conversation. Did watching Scream and studying the Columbine killers cause Brian and Torrey to murder? Or were they already predisposed to violence and simply used media as inspiration for acting on existing impulses? The debate continues with no clear answers. What's certain is that two 16-year-old boys made a conscious choice to plan and execute the murder of their classmate. They purchased weapons. They created opportunities. They filmed themselves discussing their intentions. They returned to the house wearing masks. They tampered with the power to frighten her. And then they stabbed Cassie Jo Stoddart approximately 30 times, ending her life while she fought desperately to survive. The videotaped evidence revealed an uncomfortable truth. Brian and Torrey were excited about killing. They weren't remorseful or conflicted. They were enthusiastic. They saw murder as entertainment, as an experience to pursue, as something that would make them special and notorious. The disconnect between their casual discussion of taking a life and the actual horror of stabbing a real person revealed a profound lack of empathy and a dangerous detachment from reality. Cassie Jo Stoddart should be 35 years old now. She should have graduated high school, perhaps gone to college, built a career, fallen in love, maybe started a family. She should have had decades of experiences, relationships, joys, and challenges. Instead, her life ended at 16, on the living room floor of her aunt's house, murdered by boys she thought were her friends. Matt Beckham, Cassie's boyfriend, carries the burden of having left her alone that night. Rationally, he knows his mother called him home, and he had no way of knowing what would happen. But the guilt and what-ifs likely haunt him. If he'd stayed, would Brian and Tori have aborted their plan? Would Cassie still be alive? The case serves as a dark reminder that evil can emerge at any age, in any community, from people who seem ordinary. Brian and Tori weren't obviously troubled outcasts. They attended school, had friends, and participated in normal teenage activities. Yet beneath that normal exterior was something dark, a fascination with violence, a desire to kill, and a willingness to murder a friend to satisfy their twisted curiosity. They're now known as the Scream Killers, forever associated with a horror movie they tried to recreate. But unlike in films where credits roll and actors go home, the horror they created was real. Cassie Jo Stoddart died in terror and pain. Her family's grief is permanent. And two teenagers threw away their own lives to experience a few minutes of violence they'd fantasized about. Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk will never leave prison. They'll never have careers, families, or freedom. They'll grow old in cells, serving life sentences for a murder they committed at 16. Whether they feel genuine remorse now, whether they've matured enough to understand the enormity of what they did, whether they regret their choices, none of that can change the past or bring Cassie back. The videotapes they made, thinking they were creating a documentary of their ascent to serial killer fame, instead became the evidence that ensured their conviction and life imprisonment. Their attempt to immortalize themselves as notorious killers succeeded only in documenting their guilt and guaranteeing they'd spend their lives behind bars, forgotten by most, remembered only as the boys who killed Cassie Jo Stoddart for no reason except that they wanted to know what murder felt like. Case 9. Brandon Woodruff. Brandon Woodruff seemed like the embodiment of small-town Texas values. Growing up in the community outside Dallas, he was popular, outgoing, and involved. His classmates at high school remembered him as the kid everyone liked. He was president of the Future Farmers of America, voted most school spirit, and known for his love of animals. He had a steady girlfriend and came from what appeared to be a stable, loving family. His father, Dennis, worked successfully, and his mother, Norma, was devoted to her children, including Brandon and his older sister, Charla. By 2005, Brandon was 19 years old and attending Abilene Christian University, a private Christian school. His parents supported his education and had recently moved into a new home in Royce City. Life seemed to be progressing normally for the Woodruff family. But on October 16, 2005, that normalcy shattered when both Dennis and Norma Woodruff were found shot to death in their new home. The discovery was devastating. Dennis and Norma had been murdered, their bodies found in the house they'd so recently moved into. The crime scene showed they'd been shot, and the violence suggested something deeply personal. Investigators immediately began working to determine who would want to kill this couple and why. Brandon became a person of interest almost immediately. He was the son, He'd visited the house that weekend, and detectives began building a timeline of his movements on October 16th. What they discovered would form the basis of the prosecution's case against him. But it would also become the source of ongoing controversy about whether justice was served or an innocent man was convicted. According to the prosecution's timeline, Brandon had an extremely narrow window of opportunity to commit the murders. Phone records showed calls Brandon made that bracketed the approximate time of death. The state argued that Brandon had only about 19 minutes to shoot both parents, clean up evidence, and resume normal phone activity as if nothing had happened. Defense attorneys and later the Innocence Project of Texas would argue this timeline was physically impossible, that no one could commit a double murder, manage the crime scene, and return to acting normally in such a compressed time frame. The physical evidence against Brandon was largely circumstantial, but prosecutors argued it was compelling. A dagger was found in the barn at the Woodruff family's old house in Heath, Texas. Testing revealed Dennis Woodruff's blood on the weapon. Brandon's former college roommate testified that this dagger was the same one he'd seen in Brandon's dorm room at Abilene Christian University. While the dagger wasn't the murder weapon, the Woodruffs had been shot, not stabbed. Its presence with Dennis's blood suggested Brandon had been involved in violence against his father. More damaging was evidence about a missing gun. Michelle Lee, the mother of Brandon's girlfriend, contacted law enforcement to report that a gun and ammunition were missing from her home. Brandon had visited the Lee residence the weekend before his parents were found dead. Investigators compared bullets found at the crime scene with ammunition from the Lee home and determined they were consistent with each other. The Lee family's gun was never recovered, but investigators believed it was the same caliber as the weapon used to kill Dennis and Norma. Brandon denied stealing the gun, but the timing of its disappearance and the ballistic consistency created a strong circumstantial link. As investigators dug deeper into Brandon's life, they uncovered secrets that would become central to the prosecution's motive theory. While Brandon attended Abilene Christian University, a conservative Christian institution, he'd been living a double life. He went dancing at gay clubs. He dated men. He traveled out of state to participate in adult films. None of this information had been shared with his conservative family, who had no idea about this aspect of their son's life. The prosecution argued that Brandon killed his parents to prevent these secrets from being exposed. They suggested he feared his parents discovering his sexual orientation and his participation in adult entertainment, and that he chose murder over facing their potential rejection or disappointment. The theory was that Brandon's hidden life created unbearable pressure, and when that pressure threatened to explode, he eliminated the people who represented that threat. But was this theory correct? Brandon Woodruff has maintained his innocence from the moment of his arrest through today. He insists he didn't kill his parents, that he loved them, and that the evidence against him has been misinterpreted or is simply wrong. Brandon was arrested and charged with capital murder in 2005. His trial took place in June 2007, nearly 3 years after his parents' deaths. The prosecution presented their timeline, the dagger evidence, the missing gun, the ballistic consistency, and the motive theory about Brandon's secret life. They argued that all the pieces fit together to show Brandon as the only person with means, motive, and opportunity to commit these murders. The defense countered that the evidence was entirely circumstantial. No witnesses placed Brandon at the scene during the murders. No forensic evidence definitively linked him to pulling a trigger. The timeline was impossibly compressed. And the motive theory was speculative. There was no evidence Dennis and Norma had discovered Brandon's secrets or that they'd confronted him about anything. The jury heard both sides and deliberated. In June 2007, they found Brandon Woodruff guilty of capital murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. Brandon was 22 years old at sentencing, convicted of killing the parents who had raised him, supported his education, and moved into a new home they'd never get to fully enjoy. But the case didn't end with the conviction. Questions lingered about whether justice had been served or a miscarriage of justice had occurred. The Innocence Project of Texas took on Brandon's case, citing several concerns about the evidence and the conviction. The timeline remains the most contentious issue. Allison Clayton, deputy director of the Innocence Project of Texas, has argued that cell phone records show an impossibly narrow window for the murders. Brandon kills his parents in, the most 19 minutes, Clayton said. He has to act fast, or he is taking calls during the course of committing these murders. That's the only way the timeline makes sense, that he does something to one of his parents and then takes a call and chats with a friend like nothing's wrong. The Innocence Project also points to DNA evidence that was never properly tested. Hair was found clutched in Norma Woodruff's hand, suggesting she'd grabbed her attacker during a struggle. That hair was never subjected to DNA analysis to determine if it belonged to Brandon or someone else. Clayton and other advocates argue this evidence could potentially exclude Brandon as the killer if it belonged to someone else. Additionally, the Innocence Project questions the certainty of the ballistic evidence. While bullets from the crime scene were consistent with ammunition from the Lee home, consistent with doesn't mean definitely matched to. The gun itself was never found, making definitive ballistic comparison impossible. The case raises troubling questions that plague many convictions based primarily on circumstantial evidence. Can someone be guilty beyond a reasonable doubt based on a compressed timeline, a stolen gun that was never found, a dagger with blood but that wasn't the murder weapon, and a motive theory based on secrets the victims may never have discovered? Or is the totality of circumstantial evidence, the timeline placing Brandon in proximity, the missing gun from a home he'd visited, the dagger linking him to violence involving his father's blood, the hidden life creating theoretical motive sufficient to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt? Dennis and Norma Woodruff were real people who loved their son and supported his dreams. They were murdered in their home, shot to death by someone. If Brandon didn't kill them, then their actual killer has never been found or charged. If Brandon did kill them, then he successfully maintained a false claim of innocence for nearly 2 decades. For Brandon's sister Sharla and other family members, the case created divisions and anguish. Some family members believe in Brandon's guilt and supported the prosecution. Others have doubts or believe in his innocence. The murders didn't just take Dennis and Norma's lives, they fractured the surviving family with uncertainty and conflict about what really happened. Brandon Woodruff remains incarcerated in Texas, serving his life sentence while continuing to fight for freedom. His case has been featured on true crime programs including 20/25, which examine the evidence and the questions surrounding his conviction. The Innocence Project continues to advocate for him, though no court has yet overturned his conviction or ordered a new trial. The case highlights several troubling aspects of the American criminal justice system. It shows how someone's private life, in this case Brandon's sexual orientation and participation in adult entertainment, can become evidence of motive even when there's no proof the victims knew about or objected to that private life. It demonstrates how circumstantial evidence can lead to conviction when each piece individually might not be conclusive, but together creates what prosecutors argue is an overwhelming pattern, and it raises the specter of wrongful conviction, the nightmare scenario where an innocent person spends their life in prison for a crime they didn't commit. For those who believe Brandon is guilty, the evidence paints a picture of a young man living a double life who murdered his parents to keep his secrets hidden. The stolen gun, the dagger, the timeline, the lack of any other viable suspect, all of it points to Brandon as the killer. His continued claims of innocence are seen as self-serving lies from someone who can't accept responsibility for what he did. For those who believe Brandon is innocent, the case represents a rush to judgment based on insufficient evidence. The impossibly tight timeline, the untested DNA, the lack of direct physical evidence, the speculative motive, all of it suggests reasonable doubt that should have prevented conviction. His maintained innocence is seen as the desperate plea of someone wrongly convicted. The truth, whatever it is, remains known only to the person who pulled the trigger that day in October 2005. Dennis and Norma Woodruff can't speak for themselves. The physical evidence is ambiguous enough to support competing interpretations, and Brandon Woodruff sits in a Texas prison, either a convicted killer who destroyed his family or an innocent man serving life for murders he didn't commit. Unlike the other cases in this series, where guilt is established beyond dispute through confession, overwhelming physical evidence, or video documentation, the Woodruff case exists in a murky space of uncertainty. The jury convicted him based on the evidence presented. The Innocence Project believes that evidence is insufficient or flawed. Appeals courts have so far upheld the conviction. The case continues. What we know for certain is that Dennis and Norma Woodruff were murdered in their Royce City home. We know their son Brandon had visited that weekend. We know a gun went missing from a home he'd visited. We know a dagger with Dennis's blood was found at a property connected to the family. We know Brandon had secrets from his conservative Christian family, and we know that nearly 20 years later, Brandon Woodruff maintains he didn't kill his parents while serving a life sentence for doing exactly that. The case serves as a reminder that not all criminal cases have clear, indisputable answers. Sometimes the evidence is ambiguous. Sometimes timelines are contested. Sometimes motive theories are speculative. And sometimes a conviction is handed down based on circumstantial evidence that some believe proves guilt beyond reasonable doubt, while others believe leaves too many questions unanswered. Brandon Woodruff will either die in prison as a convicted killer, or he'll one day be exonerated as a wrongfully convicted innocent man. The evidence hasn't changed since 2007. The facts remain the same, but the interpretation of those facts, whether they prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt or leave room for reasonable doubt, continues to be debated by legal advocates, true crime enthusiasts, and those who study wrongful convictions. For now, Brandon remains behind bars, maintaining his innocence, while Dennis and Norma Woodruff remain dead, their actual killer either already convicted and imprisoned or still free and never held accountable. The uncertainty itself is a tragedy, for Brandon if he's innocent, for the victims if justice was served but doubted, and for everyone involved who must live with questions that may never be definitively answered. Case 10. Adam Lanza. On December 14, 2012, before Adam Lanza became known for one of the most devastating attacks on an American elementary school, he committed his first murder. That victim was his own mother. Adam Peter Lanza was born in April 1992 in New Hampshire. By the time he reached his 20th year, he had become a deeply troubled young man living with his mother Nancy in Newtown, Connecticut. Nancy Lanza was a gun enthusiast who owned at least a dozen firearms. She regularly took her two sons to local shooting ranges where they learned to handle weapons. Friends later said Nancy never expressed fear of Adam. She kept guns in the house, slept with her bedroom door unlocked, and appeared to believe she could manage her son's increasingly severe psychological difficulties on her own. Adam had attended Sandy Hook Elementary School as a child, but his difficulties emerged clearly by middle school. His mother described him as becoming racked by anxiety. He struggled with Asperger's syndrome and other psychiatric conditions. Over the years leading up to December 2012, his isolation deepened. He refused to leave his basement bedroom for extended periods. He covered his windows. He communicated with his mother only through email, even when both were in the same house. Nancy prepared meals and left them outside his door. What Nancy Lanza may not have fully grasped was the extent of her son's obsession with mass violence. Investigators would later discover that Adam maintained a detailed spreadsheet documenting hundreds of mass murderers throughout history. He had compiled information on roughly 500 killers, studying their methods and casualty counts with clinical precision. His childhood writings contained graphic, violent fantasies. Teachers from years earlier remembered being disturbed by his compositions about battles and destruction. In the weeks before the murders, Nancy considered moving Adam to another town. She planned to purchase a recreational vehicle where he could stay while she showed their house to potential buyers. A 2014 report from Connecticut's Office of the Child Advocate suggested this planned disruption may have been a triggering factor. The report stated that Adam's severe mental health problems, combined with an obsession with violence and access to deadly weapons, created conditions for mass murder. Someone had warned authorities. Documents released years after the shooting revealed that a resident contacted Newtown Police and Sandy Hook Elementary to report that Adam had threatened his mother and schoolchildren. When police were informed, they responded that Nancy owned the firearms legally and there was nothing they could do. They suggested contacting state police instead. The warning went unheeded. Shortly before 9:30 on the morning of December 14th, Adam shot his mother 4 times in the head as she slept in her pajamas. Investigators found her body in bed. Before leaving the house, Adam destroyed his computer's hard drive, an action that would later complicate the investigation into his motives and planning. He then took his mother's car and drove approximately 5 miles to Sandy Hook Elementary School. He brought with him a Bushmaster rifle and multiple high-capacity magazines containing hundreds of rounds of ammunition. What followed in the next 11 minutes resulted in the deaths of 20 children between 6 and 7 years old, along with 6 adult staff members. By the time first responders arrived, Adam had taken his own life with a gunshot to the head. The investigation that followed revealed a young man who had slipped through multiple safety nets. Nancy had rejected recommendations from Yale University psychologists years earlier that Adam receive medication and rigorous treatment for anxiety and other conditions. School officials and family members had not adequately confronted his escalating isolation and concerning behaviors. Mental health professionals had not maintained consistent contact with him in the years before the massacre. The Connecticut report concluded that while Adam's autism spectrum disorder did not cause the shooting, the collective failure to address his deteriorating mental state and his mother's decision to keep a substantial arsenal accessible to him created the circumstances that made tragedy possible. Nancy Lanza's role in the events remains a subject of difficult examination. She was described by friends as a caring mother who genuinely tried to help her son, yet her choices proved catastrophic. She introduced him to firearms despite his known psychological vulnerabilities. She maintained an arsenal in a home with someone who was severely mentally ill and increasingly obsessed with mass violence. She chose to manage his care largely in isolation rather than pursuing sustained professional intervention. In the end, she became the first victim of the violence she had, perhaps unknowingly, helped enable. The legal system never had the opportunity to hold Adam Lanza accountable. There was no trial, no testimony, no opportunity for answers. The community and the nation were left with devastating loss and unanswered questions about why a young man who had been given advantages and opportunities chose to commit such an act. Nancy's family released a statement days after the murders expressing bewilderment and grief. The shooting prompted an immediate national reckoning. President Barack Obama addressed the nation that afternoon, visibly emotional. In the weeks and months that followed, debates intensified over gun control legislation, school security measures, and mental health treatment access. Connecticut passed some of the strictest gun laws in the nation. Schools across the country reviewed and strengthened their security protocols and lockdown procedures. The federal government proposed expanded background checks, though comprehensive gun control legislation ultimately stalled in Congress. Sandy Hook Elementary School remained closed as a crime scene before being demolished in 2014. A new school building was constructed on the same site, but with a different architectural footprint, opening in 2016. Memorials to the victims were established throughout Newtown. The families of victims pursued legal action against the manufacturers of the rifle used in the shooting, eventually reaching a settlement. Even today, more than a decade later, the name Sandy Hook evokes the enormity of loss and the failures that preceded it. The case continues to influence discussions about recognizing warning signs in troubled individuals, the responsibilities of families in managing mental health crises, and the intersection of gun access and public safety. 27 people died on December 14, 2012. Nancy Lanza was the first, killed by the son she had tried, in her own way, to protect and support. The 26 who followed at Sandy Hook Elementary became symbols of innocence destroyed and a community's call for change that continues to resonate across the nation. These 10 cases span 4 decades and represent some of the most disturbing violations of family bonds in American criminal history. What unites them is the betrayal itself. Sons who should have honored and protected their parents instead became their executioners. Whether driven by greed, lies, obsession, or perceived threats to comfortable lifestyles, each made a conscious choice to destroy the people who gave them life. The warning signs were often there: financial deception, escalating lies, substance abuse, violent histories, concerning behavior that families either missed, minimized, or desperately tried to address through intervention. For surviving family members, communities left traumatized, and society watching from afar, these cases force an uncomfortable question. How do we identify potential dangers within our own families before love, trust, and blood ties are shattered beyond repair? While some found redemption and forgiveness, as with Bart Whitaker's father, most left only grief, unanswered questions, and the permanent absence of victims who deserved to grow old peacefully. Which of these cases shocked you the most? Do you think childhood abuse justifies the Menendez brothers' actions? Or were Joel Guy Jr.'s calculated preparations the most disturbing? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into the darkest corners of true crime. What case should I cover next?